October 18, 1965. The weather over the mountains of Southeast Asia was poor. Clouds hung low, visibility was limited, and darkness was approaching rapidly. A highly classified reconnaissance operation had been launched from the base at Kham Duc, near the Laotian border. The operation was called Shining Brass. Its purpose was to gather intelligence about North Vietnamese troop movements and supply routes in the region through which the network, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, passed. Aboard one of the South Vietnamese H-34 helicopters participating in the mission was a 46-year-old captain in the United States Army Special Forces. The Americans knew him as Lauri Thorni. But he had not been born in the United States. His real name was Lauri Allen Törni. Only 3 days earlier, on October 15th, a photograph of Törni had been taken at Kham Duc. In it, the Finnish captain stands with other men involved in the operation at the base. It would become the last known photograph of Lauri Törni alive. The October 18th mission had been delayed because of poor weather. When conditions finally improved enough, 2 H-34 helicopters departed. The first carried the reconnaissance team. The second, flying in a supporting role, carried Captain Lauri Thorne and its Vietnamese crew. The reconnaissance team was successfully inserted into the operational area. But during the return flight, the weather once again became dangerous. The mountains disappeared into the clouds. Visibility deteriorated. The helicopter carrying Törni never returned to Kham Duc. Contact with the aircraft was lost, and Törni and the helicopter crew disappeared. Despite search efforts, the aircraft could not be found. Lauri Thorne was listed as missing. The United States Armed Forces later declared him killed in action. Törni was promoted to major after his disappearance. The exact location of his fate, however, would remain a mystery for decades. But there was an even greater question. How had a Finnish boy born in Viipuri in 1919 ended up as an American Special Forces officer on the other side of the world? The answer passes through the Winter War, the Continuation War, Germany, a Finnish prison, a crossing of the Atlantic, the United States Army, and the Vietnam War. This is the story of Lauri Törni. On October 18, 1965, Lauri Törni had disappeared. His helicopter never returned to the base at Kham Duc, and the search conducted across the difficult mountain terrain failed to locate the aircraft or its crew. For the United States Army, the situation was particularly difficult. Törni had disappeared in a region where dense jungle, steep mountain slopes, and rapidly changing weather made search operations extremely challenging. The location of the helicopter crash could not be confirmed. Törni's body was not found. There was also no certain information about his final moments. Lauri Thorne became a missing soldier shortly after his disappearance. He was promoted to major. He was later posthumously awarded high-ranking American military decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Legion of Merit. But one thing was missing: an answer to where he was. The years passed. The Vietnam War continued. For almost another decade, American forces withdrew from Vietnam. Saigon fell in 1975. But Lauri Thorne's name remained among those American servicemen whose fate had not been conclusively resolved. For decades, his story appeared to end on an unknown mountainside somewhere in Southeast Asia. In reality, however, the final chapter of Törni's story had not yet been written. During the 1990s, investigators once again began closing in on the location of the missing helicopter. In 1999, an investigation and excavation involving American, Vietnamese, and Finnish participants examined the suspected crash site. Pieces of the helicopter were recovered from the ground, personal items, and human remains. Eventually, modern forensic techniques would help solve a mystery that had remained unanswered for more than 3 decades. But we will return to that much later, because before we can understand why Lauri Törni died on the other side of the world wearing an American uniform, we must travel almost half a century back in time. Back to Finland, back to the Karelian Isthmus, back to Viipuri, to the year 1919. May 28, 1919, in the Finnish city of Viipuri, a boy was born and given the name Lauri Törni. At the time, of course, no one could have known what an extraordinary life he would eventually lead. When Törni was born, Finland had been an independent nation for less than a year and a half. The young country had only recently emerged from the bloody Finnish Civil War of 1918, whose scars were still visible throughout Finnish society. Finland's eastern neighbor was also undergoing enormous change. The Russian Empire had collapsed in revolution, and Russia itself was engulfed in civil war. On the edge of this unstable world stood Lauri Törni's hometown, Viipuri, located on the Karelian Isthmus. Viipuri was one of Finland's most important cities. It was a major center of commerce, industry, and transportation, with a history stretching back for centuries. The city's harbor connected Viipuri by sea with the rest of Finland and the wider world. Its railways carried people and goods across the country. Viipuri was also a multicultural city. Along its streets and inside its shops, Finnish could be heard alongside languages such as Swedish, Russian, and German. Above the city stood the medieval Viipuri Castle, a reminder of the region's long and often turbulent history. Viipuri's location also made the city strategically important. The border with Soviet Russia was nearby. Beyond that frontier stood the city of Petrograd, later known as Leningrad. In the future, this geography would become one of the central issues in the tensions between Finland and the Soviet Union. But in 1919, those events still lay far in the future. Lauri Törni was a newborn child. His father was Lauri Törni, who worked as a coastal shipmaster. His mother was Rosa Törni, née Kosonen. The family lived in the Hiekka area of Viipuri. It was here that Lauri would spend his childhood and much of his youth. Viipuri would be his home, its streets, surrounding countryside, and the landscapes of the Karelian Isthmus would form the environment in which he grew into adulthood. 20 years later, everything would change. Then the border between the Soviet Union and Finland would no longer be merely a line drawn on a map. War would come to the Karelian Isthmus, and Lauri Törni, born in Viipuri, would be among the young Finnish men sent to face it. But before there was a soldier, there was a boy, and to understand the soldier, we must first understand that boy. Lauri Törni grew up in the Hiekka area of Viipuri, in an ordinary Finnish family. His father, Lauri Törni, worked as a coastal shipmaster. His mother, Rosa Törni, née Kosonen, had previously operated a delicatessen shop in Viipuri's famous market hall. As the family grew, however, she remained at home to take care of the household. The family's first son, Antu, had died when he was still very young. After Lauri, 2 daughters were born, Salme and Kaija Lauri, therefore grew up as the older brother of 2 younger sisters. The Törni family's financial position gradually improved. They acquired a large house on Lautakartananti in the Hiekka area. The building contained 16 rooms. This was considerably more space than the family itself required, so some of the rooms were rented to tenants. The image later associated with Törni has often focused almost entirely on war. His name is connected with battles, dangerous patrol missions, and special operations. During his childhood, however, there was little to suggest such an extraordinary military career. Törni's childhood has been described as relatively secure. He did not grow up on a battlefield or in a military family, but even as a boy, aspects of his character were beginning to appear that would later become familiar to his fellow soldiers. Lauri was active and physically inclined. He enjoyed exercise and outdoor activities. Skiing and swimming were among his interests. The environment of the Karelian Isthmus provided excellent opportunities for both forests, lakes, and long winters were a natural part of the world in which he grew up. Later, the ability to move quickly through difficult forest terrain would become one of his strengths as a soldier. Törni was also associated with a powerful streak of stubbornness. Well-known story from his school years illustrates this. At Hiekka Primary School, Lauri was supposed to complete a singing examination. He did not want to sing. His teacher reportedly gave him two choices. Either he would sing or he would repeat the school year. Lauri refused to sing, so he repeated the year. A small event from childhood cannot, of course, explain the person he later became, but the story illustrates a characteristic that would appear repeatedly in later accounts of Törni. Once he had made a decision, changing his mind was not easy. At the same time, the world around him inevitably influenced the young Törni. The Finnish Civil War of 1918 had ended only a year before his birth. Memories of the conflict remained present throughout Finnish society. The events had also touched his own family. Lauri Törni had been detained by the Reds during the Civil War, although he had not participated in the actual fighting. The upbringing in the Törni household has subsequently been described as patriotic, but young Lauri was not yet a soldier. He was a boy growing up in Viipuri, skiing, swimming, spending time outdoors, and attending school. Gradually, however, his interests began turning increasingly toward sports and military activities, and soon he would take his first concrete step into that world. At only about 12 years of age, Lauri Törni joined the activities of the Viipuri Civil Guard. During Lauri Törni's youth, one characteristic became increasingly clear. He enjoyed physical activity. Schoolwork did not seem to interest him in the same way as sports, outdoor activities, and practical pursuits. Viipuri and the surrounding Karelian Isthmus provided the young Törni with excellent opportunities for an active life. He skied and swam, and gradually his interests also turned toward boxing. This hobby had an interesting connection to the Törni family home. The family's large house had enough space to accommodate tenants. One of the young men who lived there belonged to the Shushan family and was the brother of Sten Suvio. Sten Suvio was a boxer from the Viipuri region and would become one of the great names in Finnish. Boxing, Törni and Suvio knew each other. Suvio taught the young Lauri how to box. Törni also trained with Viipurin Nyrkkeilijät, a boxing club founded in 1929. Boxing suited his character well. The sport demanded physical fitness, quick reactions, courage, and the ability to continue even when an opponent fought back. In 1936, Sten Suvio's name became known throughout Finland. At the Olympic Games in Berlin, he competed in the welterweight division. Suvio advanced all the way to the final, where he defeated Germany's Michael Murach. Sten Suvio became an Olympic champion. For the young Törni, therefore, Suvio was not simply a famous Finnish athlete. He was a man Törni knew personally and from whom he had received boxing instruction. Sport also had another significance in Törni's youth: skiing. Physical endurance and the ability to move through difficult terrain were skills that would later become extremely useful during his military career. But at this stage, Törni knew nothing of the wars that lay ahead. He was a young man growing up in Viipuri and searching for his place in life. Education was not becoming his chosen path. Sport interested him more, and military activities were beginning to interest him even more. Törni had already joined the activities of the Viipuri Civil Guard there. The athletic young man would encounter an entirely different set of skills: marching, moving through difficult terrain, marksmanship, and military discipline. Step by step, Lauri Törni's life was beginning to move toward a world from which he would not truly separate for decades. The world of the soldier. In 1931, Lauri Törni was only 12 years old. That same year, he joined the activities of the Viipuri Civil Guard. This was one of his first significant steps toward military life. The Finnish Civil Guards were a voluntary national defense organization that held an important position in Finland between the World Wars. The organization's roots extended back to the period of Finnish independence and the Civil War of 1918. After the Civil War, the Civil Guards developed into a nationwide organization whose purpose included maintaining and improving the military preparedness of its members. During the 1930s, Civil Guard activities were visible in communities throughout Finland. In a city such as Viipuri, Geography also emphasized the importance of national defense. The Soviet border was nearby. Beyond it stood Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities. Törni joined the Civil Guard's youth activities. For young participants, this did not mean actual military service. Instead, the activities primarily involved physical exercise, sports, outdoor activities, and skills connected with national defense. This suited Törni well. He already enjoyed sports and the outdoors. Now, those interests became connected with organized national defense activities. Sport played an important role within the Civil Guards. Skiing, orienteering, and other activities that developed physical fitness also helped prepare young men for their later military service. In Törni's case, precisely these kinds of abilities would later prove extremely valuable. The most famous phases of his military career would take place in forests and difficult terrain, where physical endurance, navigation, and the ability to move quickly were essential. But in 1931, none of that future was yet known. Törni was simply one of many Finnish boys participating in Civil Guard activities. He remained involved with the organization throughout his youth. The years passed. At the same time, the situation in Europe changed. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. The Soviet Union expanded its military strength. In Finland, developments among the great powers were watched closely. Törni, meanwhile, grew from a boy into a young man. Civil Guard activities remained part of his life until 1939. By then, his interest in military life had become much more serious. But before war erupted in Europe, Törni would make one decisive choice. In the autumn of 1938, he volunteered to begin his military service ahead of schedule. The young member of the Civil Guard was about to become a soldier in the Finnish Army. On September 3, 1938, a new phase began in the life of Lauri Törni. He was 19 years old. Törni volunteered to begin his compulsory military service ahead of schedule. His destination was Kiviniemi in Sakola, on the Karelian Isthmus. The 4th Jaeger Battalion was stationed there. For the first time, Törni was now officially a soldier in the Finnish Army. He did not enter military life completely unprepared. He had already participated in the activities of the Viipuri Civil Guard for several years. He was athletic, a capable skier, and accustomed to physical exertion. Now, these qualities began to be developed through systematic military training. The Jaeger battalions were among the mobile formations of the Finnish Army. Their soldiers needed good physical fitness and the ability to operate rapidly across different types of terrain. Törni was assigned to the machine gun company of the 4th Jaeger Battalion. The daily life of a conscript was disciplined. The days were filled with training, weapons handling, marching, field, exercises, physical training, and the constant repetition of a soldier's fundamental skills. Törni appeared to adapt well to this kind of life. After only a few months, he was sent for non-commissioned officer training. It was an indication that he was considered capable of handling greater responsibility. Törni also demonstrated his ability as a marksman. During his military service, he qualified as an elite class shooter. Later, weapons handling, physical endurance, and the ability to operate independently would become important elements of his reputation as a soldier. But in 1938, he was still only a young conscript. At the same time, events beyond Finland's borders were unfolding that would soon transform his life. Tensions in Europe were rising. Rapidly, Germany was expanding its influence. Under Adolf Hitler, the Soviet Union was strengthening its armed forces, and Törni, training at Kiviniemi, was only a short distance from the Soviet border. In the autumn of 1938, no one yet knew for certain that Europe was heading toward another world war. Törni's military service was supposed to be only one stage in the life of a young Finnish man. When his service eventually ended, he should have returned to civilian life. In practice, that never really happened. By the time Lauri Törni's regular military service was approaching its end in the autumn of 1939, The Second World War had already begun in Europe, and along Finland's eastern border, the situation was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. Törni's military training was about to become real war. The year 1939 changed Europe. At the same time, it changed Lauri Törni's future. Törni continued his military service with the 4th Jaeger Battalion on the Karelian Isthmus. He had trained in the machine gun company, completed non-commissioned officer training, and demonstrated his ability as a skilled marksman. Under normal circumstances, his military service would soon have ended. But beyond Finland's borders, events were moving rapidly. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. It became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, the two countries promised not to attack one another. The agreement, however, contained a secret additional protocol in which Germany and the Soviet Union divided parts of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland was assigned to the Soviet sphere. Just over a week later, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun in Europe. On September 17th, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland from the east. Poland was trapped between two great powers. The Soviet Union soon began applying pressure to the Baltic states as well. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania accepted agreements that allowed the Soviet Union to establish military bases and station troops on their territory. In Finland, these developments were watched with growing concern. In October, the Soviet Union also summoned Finnish representatives to negotiations in Moscow. Among other demands, the Soviet Union wanted the border on the Karelian Isthmus moved farther away from Leningrad, islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the lease of the Hanko Peninsula for a military base. In exchange, Finland was offered territory in eastern Karelia. The Finnish government was prepared to make some concessions, but it would not accept the Soviet demands in their entirety. The negotiations failed to produce an agreement. At the same time, Finland prepared for the worst. In October, so-called extraordinary exercises were ordered. The name sounded peaceful, but in practice they amounted to a large-scale mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of Finnish men were called into service. Defensive positions on the Karelian Isthmus were constructed and strengthened. Civilians were evacuated from the most vulnerable border regions. The threat of war also hung over Viipuri Törni's own home was located in a region that would be close to one of the most important fronts if war began. November 16, 1939, Törni's regular period of military service came to an end. He had served for 440 days. Normally, this would have meant a return to civilian life. For Törni, however, civilian life effectively lasted only a moment. The Finnish army needed trained men. He immediately returned to service. Then, on November 26, something decisive happened. The Soviet Union claimed that Finnish artillery had fired across the border at the Soviet village of Manila and demanded that Finnish troops withdraw farther from the frontier. Finland denied firing the shots and proposed a joint investigation of the incident. The Soviet Union rejected the proposal. A few days later, it renounced the non-aggression pact between Finland and the Soviet Union. Diplomatic relations were broken. On the morning of November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border. Bombers appeared over Finnish cities. The Winter War had begun, and 20-year-old Lauri Törni was already waiting in the ranks of the Finnish army. November 30th, 1939. It was shortly before 7 in the morning when Soviet forces began their attack on Finland. Without a formal declaration of war, Red Army troops crossed the frontier at several points. Artillery. Fire began on the Karelian Isthmus. Soviet aircraft took to the skies and bombed Finnish targets. The Winter War had begun. Lauri Törni was 20 years old. His regular period of military service had ended only 2 weeks earlier. But because of the growing crisis, he was already back in the ranks of the Finnish Army. Törni served as a non-commissioned officer in the 4th Jaeger Battalion. Now, more than a year of military training would be tested in real war for the first time. Finland faced one of the largest armed forces in the world, the Soviet Union, possessed an enormous superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The Red Army leadership expected Finnish resistance to collapse quickly. During the first days of the war, Finnish troops in many border areas of the Karelian Isthmus withdrew toward prepared defensive positions. Roads were destroyed, bridges were blown up, buildings were burned so that the advancing enemy could not use them for shelter or accommodation. The Finns attempted to slow the Red Army's advance and gain time to organize their main defenses. For Törni, the war represented an enormous change. During training, the enemy had been imaginary. Now there were real soldiers on the other side, real weapons and real artillery fire. A mistake could cost a human life. The 4th Jaeger Battalion was a mobile formation whose soldiers needed speed and the ability to operate effectively across difficult terrain. In such a unit, the skills Törni had previously developed were valuable. Was a capable skier, he was physically fit. He had been recognized as a skilled marksman, and his years in the Civil Guard had accustomed him to operating outdoors even before his formal military service. But no amount of training could completely prepare a young man for the reality of war during the opening days. It also quickly became clear that the conflict would not be short or easy. The Red Army continued applying pressure on the Karelian Isthmus. At the same time, Soviet forces attacked across Finland's long eastern frontier in several other sectors. The Finns had to defend an enormous area with considerably smaller forces. Törni's first war had begun, but one decisive change was still ahead of him. The 4th Jaeger Battalion would not remain on the Karelian Isthmus. In December, the battalion was transferred to a new front, north of Lake Ladoga. There, among forests and frozen lakes, an entirely different kind of war would be fought. And there Lauri Törni would gain his first experience of patrol operations, which would later become one of the defining features of his military career. In December 1939, Lauri Törni's war took a new direction. The 4th Jaeger Battalion was transferred from the Karelian Isthmus to the region north of Lake Ladoga. Here, the battlefield was very different. The landscape of Ladoga Karelia was dominated by forests, lakes, marshes, and a limited network of roads. Winter made movement even more difficult. The snow grew deeper. Temperatures fell. The hours of daylight became shorter. For large motorized formations, this environment was difficult. Soviet forces depended heavily on roads along which soldiers, vehicles, artillery, and supplies had to move. For the Finns, the forests offered very different possibilities. Troops on skis could move through terrain away from the roads. They could circle around enemy flanks, observe Soviet movements, and strike from unexpected directions. It was precisely in this environment that Törni began gaining experience in missions that would later become an important part of his military career. Patrol operations. A patrol might be ordered to reconnoiter enemy positions, determine the strength of enemy forces, observe traffic, find new routes through the terrain, or gather intelligence before a larger attack. These missions were dangerous. A small group might operate for hours or even longer, far from its own positions. In the forest, the enemy might remain unseen until it was extremely close. A sound could reveal a position. The movement of skis, a breaking branch, a word spoken at the wrong moment. Any of these could become decisive. Törni was well suited to this type of activity. He was young and physically fit. He was a capable skier. He was a skilled marksman. And even before entering the army, he had been accustomed to moving through the outdoors. During the Winter War, Törni served both as a patrol member and as a patrol leader. His responsibility increased. A patrol leader had to ensure not only that the mission was completed, but also that his men found their way back to friendly lines. He had to make decisions quickly, and sometimes without any opportunity to ask higher command for guidance. Experiences like these taught Törni independent leadership. At the same time, north of Lake Ladoga, one of the most famous situations of the Winter War was developing. Finnish forces had succeeded in cutting roads used by Soviet troops and isolating large enemy formations from one another. These surrounded formations became known to the Finns as Mahtis, and one of the most famous Mahti areas was located at a place called Lemeti. There, Törni would find himself in the middle of one of the Winter War's fiercest encirclement battles. During the winter of 1940, Lauri Törni served in the middle of one of the most famous battle areas of the Winter War, north of Lake Ladoga. Finnish forces had succeeded in stopping several Soviet formations. The terrain favored the defenders. Only a limited number of proper roads ran through the dense forests. Large Soviet formations, tanks, artillery, and supply services depended heavily on these routes. The Finns recognized an opportunity. Instead of attempting to destroy a larger enemy force in a single direct battle, they cut roads and lines of communication. Soviet formations were isolated into smaller groups. The Finns began calling these surrounded formations Mahtis. The word came from Finnish forestry. Originally, a Mahti referred to a measured stack of cut firewood. During the war, the word acquired a new meaning. An enemy formation was divided into smaller sections and isolated from its surroundings. One of the most famous areas where this occurred was Lemeti. There, elements of the Soviet 18th Rifle Division and the 34th Light Tank Brigade became surrounded by Finnish forces. Several separate encirclements formed around Lemeti. The fighting was difficult for both sides. The surrounded Soviet troops possessed tanks and heavy weapons, but their supply connections had been severely disrupted. Food, ammunition, fuel, medicine, everything was constantly needed. The Soviet Union also attempted to supply its surrounded forces from the air. The Finns, meanwhile, tightened the encirclements and attempted to eliminate the Mahtis one by one. Conditions were merciless. Temperatures during the winter of 1939 were at times extremely severe. Men had to fight and sleep in snow-covered forests. Frostbite could become almost as dangerous as enemy fire during these battles northeast of Lake Ladoga. Törni served on patrol missions. He operated both as a patrol member and as a patrol leader. It was during this period that his responsibilities began to increase. Leading a small patrol demanded very different qualities from training at a military barracks. A patrol leader had to understand maps and terrain. He had to assess enemy movements. He had to decide when to continue a mission and when to withdraw. And every decision also involved the lives of the other men. During the Winter War, Törni was not yet a famous soldier. His name was not known. Throughout Finland, he was a young non-commissioned officer learning warfare through experience. But his performance was noticed. In February 1940, Törni's military career took another step forward. He was promoted to sergeant, and soon his superiors sent him for training that would change his position in the Finnish Army. Lauri Törni was about to become an officer. By the beginning of February 1940, Lauri Törni's first war had lasted a little more than 2 months. In that short time, he had already gained experience that could never be learned during peacetime exercises. He had moved through winter forests on patrols. He had led men. He had witnessed the reality of the encirclement battles in Ladoga, Karelia, and his performance had attracted the attention of his superiors. Törni was promoted to sergeant, but soon his military career took an even more significant step forward. On February 5, 1940, he was ordered to attend a reserve officer course at Niinisalo. Törni had to leave the front. He was only 20 years old, less than a year and a half earlier. He had begun his military service as an ordinary conscript. Now, the Finnish army was training him to become an officer. The purpose of reserve officer training was to prepare men to command troops in battle. In Törni's case, the situation was unusual. He did not arrive with experience from training, exercises alone. He already had genuine experience of war. He knew what it was like to move through an area where the enemy might be nearby. He knew that a leader's decisions could have immediate Consequences for the lives of other men. At Niinistalo, systematic officer training was added to those experiences. Tactics, leadership, weapons training, map reading, and commanding troops in different combat situations. At the same time, the war continued without Törni. On the Karelian Isthmus, Finland's situation became increasingly difficult during February. The Red Army concentrated enormous quantities of artillery, troops, and tanks against the Finnish defensive positions. The Mannerheim line was broken. Finnish troops were forced to withdraw. Törni's hometown of Viipuri was now close to the decisive battles of the war. By March, Finland's situation was becoming unsustainable. Men had been lost, ammunition was being consumed, and the Soviet Union's material superiority was enormous. On March 12, 1940, Finland and the Soviet Union signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. The fighting ended the following morning. The Winter War was over. It had lasted 105 days. Finland had preserved its independence, but the terms of peace were severe. Finland was forced to surrender extensive territories to the Soviet Union. Among them was much of the Karelian Isthmus, and Viipuri, Lauri Törni's childhood home, was left beyond the new border. His family was forced to become evacuees, along with hundreds of thousands of other Karelians. Törni himself was still undergoing officer training. When the war ended, his own winter war had effectively ended when he left the front for Niinistalo, but his first war had changed the direction of his life. On May 9, 1940, Törni was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the reserve. Less than 2 years earlier, he had begun his military service as an ordinary soldier. Now, he was a young officer in the Finnish army. The war was over, but Törni's military career did not end with it. He remained in army service as a platoon commander, and the World War raging across Europe was only beginning. In the spring of 1940, Finland was at peace. But it was a very different kind of peace from the one that had existed before the Winter War. The Moscow Peace Treaty had ended the fighting, but Finland had been forced to surrender extensive territories to the Soviet Union. One of the lost cities was Viipuri. For Lauri Törni, the loss was personal. Viipuri was not simply a point on a map. It was the city where he had been born. It was where he had grown up. It was where his family had lived, and now the city stood on the Soviet side of the new frontier. The Törni family was among the hundreds of thousands of Karelians who were forced to leave their home. Regent Lauri himself, meanwhile, was moving ever deeper into military life. In May 1940, he completed his reserve officer training and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. Törni did not permanently return to civilian life. He remained in army service as a platoon commander. The experience he had gained during the Winter War had turned the 21-year-old Törni into a young officer, but Finland's security situation remained dangerous. The Soviet Union was now closer to Finland's vital regions. In the Gulf of Finland, the Soviet Union gained the use of the Hanko military base. On the Karelian Isthmus, the new frontier ran considerably farther west than before. At the same time, the war in Europe continued. In the spring of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. German forces then attacked the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. In June, France fell. Within only a few months, the military situation in Europe had changed completely. Finland was in a difficult position. The decisive assistance expected from the Western powers during the Winter War had failed to arrive in time. Germany now controlled Norway and Denmark. While the Soviet Union continued to exert pressure from the east, the small country had to find a way to secure its position between two great powers. During 1940, relations between Finland and Germany gradually became closer. German troops received transit rights through Finland to northern Norway. Finland once again began receiving weapons from Germany. Finnish military leaders closely followed the changing situation in Europe. For Törni as well, the period following the Winter War was more a time of preparation than a return to normal life. He now possessed combat experience, he had officer training, and he remained in military service. The Winter War had also left him with an experience that would remain with him for a long time. His hometown had been lost. Viipuri was now beyond the new frontier. In the spring of 1941, an opportunity appeared that would take Törni's military career in an entirely new direction. Finnish volunteers began to be recruited for military training in Germany. Törni volunteered. In May 1941, he was accepted. At the beginning of June, Lauri Törni left Finland. His destination was Germany, and for the first time in his life, he would wear the uniform of an army other than Finland's. In the spring of 1941, the European War was once again approaching Finland. Cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union was breaking down. At the same time, military contacts between Finland and Germany had become increasingly close. In this situation, recruitment began in Finland for a Finnish volunteer. Formation to serve in the German Waffen-SOG. The aim was to assemble Finnish men for military training in Germany. Recruitment in Finland was handled through an organization operating under the cover name Engineering Office Ratas. Lauri Törni also volunteered. At the time, he was a 21-year-old reserve second lieutenant and already a veteran of the Winter War. In May 1941, he was accepted among the volunteers leaving for Germany. At the beginning of June, Törni departed from Finland. This was the first time he entered the service of the German armed forces. Törni was attached to a formation of Finnish volunteers, initially known as SS Frivilligen Battalion Nordost. Because Törni was already a Finnish officer, he was given an officer's rank in the Waffen-SS. He became an SS Untersturmführer. The rank was roughly equivalent to second lieutenant in the Finnish army. Törni now wore the uniform of the Waffen-SS. This period of his life has subsequently generated considerable discussion. However, it is important to distinguish between what Törni actually did in 1941 and claims that have sometimes been made about his later life. During this first period in Germany, Törni did not reach the Eastern Front. His service took place in Germany and Austria. At the same time, an enormous military operation was being prepared in Europe. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. The European war immediately became even larger. The situation between Finland and the Soviet Union also escalated. On June 25th, Soviet aircraft bombed targets in Finland. Finland declared that it was once again at war with the Soviet Union. The continuation war had begun, but Lauri Törni was not in Finland. He was still serving with the Waffen-SS. His first period of SS service, however, was brief. There were more officers among the Finnish volunteers than the formation required. Törni was one of these so-called supernumerary officers. For this reason, the SS decided to return some of the Finnish officers to their homeland. Törni was among them. At the end of July 1941, his first period of service in Germany came to an end. He had not participated in frontline combat there, nor did he remain with the Finnish SS Volunteer Battalion to fight on the Eastern Front. Instead, he returned to Finland, and his homeland was once again at war. This time, the Finnish army was no longer merely defending the borders established by the 1940 peace treaty. Finnish forces were beginning an offensive toward the territories lost in the Winter War and later also beyond the old frontier. Törni returned to service in the Finnish army. He was given command of a platoon in the 1st Division's 8th Light Detachment. Ahead of him lay the longest and bloodiest war of his military career up to that point, the Continuation War. At the end of July 1941, Lauri Törni returned to Finland from Germany. His first period of service with the Waffen-SS had lasted only a few weeks. Törni had not participated in combat with the German forces. But when he returned to Finland, he arrived in a country that was once again at war. The Continuation War had begun at the end of June. The Finnish army was moving on to the offensive. One objective was to recapture the territories Finland had been forced to surrender. to the Soviet Union after the Winter War. For Törni, this also had a personal significance. Among the lost territories was his own home region, Viipuri. After returning to Finland, Törni once again entered service with the Finnish army. He was given command of a platoon in the 8th Jaeger Battalion of the 1st Division. Törni was now in a very different position from the one he had occupied at the beginning of the Winter War. Then, he had been a young, non-commissioned officer only beginning to gain his first experience of war. Now, he was a trained officer. He had combat experience. From the Winter War, he had led patrols, he had completed reserve officer training, and he had also received military training in Germany. As a platoon commander, Törni was no longer responsible only for his own actions. He now had to lead his men in battle. During the summer of 1941, Finnish forces advanced rapidly on several fronts. On the Karelian Isthmus, the objective was to recover territories lost during the Winter War north of Lake Ladoga. Finnish troops advanced eastward. Törni's formation fought in Ladoga, Karelia. The terrain was already partly familiar to him. Forests, lakes, narrow roads, and long distances. But the war of the summer of 1941 was very different from the Winter War. Now the Finns were advancing, and attacking force constantly needed to determine where the enemy was and where it was. Withdrawing. Reconnaissance became increasingly important, so did the ability to move quickly and exploit the terrain. It was precisely in these kinds of tasks that Törni's strengths again began to appear. He possessed physical endurance. He was a skilled marksman. He understood the fundamentals of patrol operations. And above all, he was willing to take risks. But the offensive phase was dangerous. The Red Army was retreating in many areas, but it continued fighting, delaying actions against the Finns. Ambushes could be waiting in the forests. Roads could be mined. Bridges were destroyed during withdrawals. Every new village, forest, and bend in the road could conceal the enemy. For Törni, these months provided another kind of education in warfare. During the Winter War, he had learned to operate with the patrols of a defending army. Now he was learning to command men as part of an advancing army. During the summer and autumn, Finnish forces advanced deeper into Karelia. At the end of August, Finnish troops recaptured Viipuri. Törni's birthplace was once again under Finnish control, but the Finnish offensive did not stop everywhere at the 1939 frontier. In East Karelia, Finnish forces continued their advance beyond the old border and into Soviet territory. Törni's war would continue there as well, and soon he would enter a battle that nearly ended his military career before it had truly begun. Lauri Törni would be seriously wounded, but he would return. In August 1941, Lauri Törni was back in Finland and heading toward the front. His brief period in Germany was over. Now he wanted to return to the war. Törni sought a position with Light Detachment 8 of the 1st Division, commanded by Captain Lars Rönnqvist. On August 8, 1941, Törni and his fellow officer Kosti Paukala arrived at the detachment's 3rd Company. It was a machine gun company. Törni was given command of a machine gun platoon, but his assignment soon changed. On August 21st, Törni was appointed commander of Light Detachment 8's tank platoon. It was an unusual assignment for the young officer. Törni was known as a skier, marksman, and patrol soldier. Now he had to command tanks. The platoon's equipment included Vickers tanks in Finnish service, and its strength was also supplemented with captured equipment. During the summer and autumn of 1941, the Finnish army advanced into East Karelia Light Detachment. 8 was a mobile formation whose missions emphasized speed and the ability to operate near the spearhead of the advancing army. Törni's tank platoon participated in the advance during this offensive phase. Ahead were forests, poor roads, waterways, and Soviet defensive positions. Commanding tanks in such an environment was very different from operating on an open battlefield. Narrow roads restricted movement. Forests provided cover. For the enemy, a destroyed bridge or a mined road could stop an advance completely once again. Törni had to learn quickly. During the autumn, Light Detachment 8 advanced toward Petrozavodsk. By the end of September, Finnish forces were approaching the city from several directions. Petrozavodsk was the capital of Soviet Karelia and an important transportation center. On October 1, 1941, Finnish forces captured the city. The Finns renamed it Ääneslänne. But Törni's war did not end at Petrozavodsk. The advance continued north toward Kondopoga, and eventually, Medvezhegorsk autumn turned into winter. Road conditions deteriorated. Snow and freezing temperatures made operations increasingly difficult. Finnish forces had now advanced far beyond Finland's 1939 borders. This was a very different war from the defensive struggle of the Winter War. Törni was now participating in the advance of an attacking army into Soviet territory. After the battles around Medvezhegorsk, his period as a tank platoon commander came to an end. In January 1942, Törni received a new assignment. He was transferred to Infantry Regiment 56 as a platoon commander. The offensive phase was gradually developing into positional warfare. The front lines began to stabilize, but remaining stationary did not appear to suit Törni particularly well. He once again began seeking opportunities for patrol missions, and in March 1942, one such patrol would nearly cost him his life. In late March 1942, Lauri Törni was once again where he seemed most comfortable, on patrol near the front lines. The offensive phase had ended, and the war had developed into positional warfare. Finnish and Soviet forces had dug into their positions, and instead of major offensives, smaller reconnaissance and patrol missions were constantly conducted. Along the front, Törni had been promoted to lieutenant at the beginning of March, but his new rank did not change the way he operated. He still wanted to go into the field himself. In late March, Törni set out with a small group of men on a prisoner capture patrol. The objective was to approach Soviet positions and capture an enemy soldier. Prisoners were valuable sources of intelligence. They could provide information about enemy units, positions, and plans. Törni's patrol advanced close to the enemy lines. The men waited for a suitable opportunity, but the plan failed. No prisoner was captured. The patrol began its journey back toward the Finnish lines. The weather was poor. A snowstorm reduced visibility. Then, something happened that Törni had not expected. He struck the tripwire of a Finnish pipe mine. The mine exploded. Fragments struck Törni in several parts of his body. His wounds were serious. Törni could no longer continue under his own power. The other members of the patrol had to get the wounded officer away from the area. Törni was placed in a pulk. His comrades began pulling him through the snow toward the Finnish positions, transporting a seriously wounded man near. The front was slow and exhausting. Every kilometer took time. But Törni was brought back to the Finnish side. He was transported for medical treatment. The severity of his injuries now became apparent. Törni had suffered shrapnel wounds to several parts of his body. The injuries also caused partial paralysis. His condition was serious enough that doctors even considered amputating one of his legs. At only 22 years old, Törni's military career appeared to be in danger of ending there, but it did not. Törni began to recover. Once again, his physical condition worked in his favor. His recovery progressed better than expected. He spent months undergoing treatment and recuperating. Normally, a soldier who had been wounded this seriously might have been cautious about returning to the front. With Törni, the problem was almost the opposite. When he was eventually granted convalescent leave, he could not remain away from the front. He returned to his unit before he was supposed to. Törni had survived one of the most serious wounds of his military career, but the years ahead would demonstrate that the mine had not changed his willingness to accept dangerous assignments. Quite the opposite. His reputation as a patrol soldier was only beginning. In the spring of 1942, Lauri Törni lay in a hospital seriously wounded. Fragments from the mine had injured several parts of his body, and his wounds had also caused partial paralysis. For a time, it appeared possible that his military career was over, but Törni recovered. During the summer and autumn of 1942, his condition gradually improved. After his period in hospital, he was ordered to take convalescent leave. Törni's attitude toward recovery, however, was characteristic of him. He did not want to wait. Although he was supposed to remain away from the front, he returned to his unit on his own initiative. The war Törni returned to had changed. The major Finnish offensives of 1941 were over. The front lines had stabilized deep inside East Karelia. A long period of positional warfare began. Instead of major offensives, days could be spent constructing positions, standing guard and waiting, but the front was not quiet. Both sides constantly attempted to discover what was happening behind the enemy lines. Reconnaissance patrols were sent close to and behind enemy positions. Their missions included observing troop movements, locating defensive positions, and capturing prisoners for interrogation. This type of warfare suited Törni. Better than remaining stationary, he already had experience of patrol operations from the winter war. He knew how to move through forests. He was a capable skier and marksman, and he was willing to go to places where not every soldier could be sent. During 1942, Törni once again participated in patrol operations, but positional warfare was dangerous precisely because both sides knew the area. The enemy could mine commonly used routes. Patrols could be ambushed. A single mistake could reveal an entire group. Törni's own wounding had already demonstrated this. Still, he continued. During 1943, his assignments began to change. Törni was transferred for duties under the 1st Division. He was given responsibility for leading a formation focused on reconnaissance and patrol operations. This was a significant step. Until this point, Törni had been one of many Finnish officers. Now a unit was beginning to form around him whose methods were based on precisely the skills at which he excelled: mobility, reconnaissance, surprise, rapid strikes, and operations by small groups in difficult terrain. Men were needed, but not just anyone was wanted for these missions. Törni looked for soldiers capable of enduring physical hardship and operating independently among the men who joined. The unit were individuals whose names would later become famous. One of them was Mauno Koivisto, a young Finnish soldier who, decades later, would become president of the Republic of Finland. But in 1943, he was one of Törni's men. Gradually, this formation developed into a unit whose name would become permanently associated with its commander, Detachment Törni. Lauri Törni was now approaching the most famous period of his military career. During 1943, Lauri Törni's military career began moving toward the period for which he would become best known in Finland. The continuation war had already lasted for almost 2 years. The front between Finland and the Soviet Union had largely stabilized. There were few major offensive operations. But between the front lines, another kind of war continued constantly. Patrols moved through the forests. Enemy positions were reconnoitered. Attempts were made to capture prisoners for interrogation. Mines were laid, and small raiding. Parties could penetrate behind enemy lines. Törni had demonstrated that he was particularly well suited to this kind of warfare. He had experience of patrol operations dating back to the Winter War. He was a capable skier and marksman. He understood the forest, and above all, he was willing to personally lead dangerous missions. During 1943, Törni was given command of a Jaeger company formed from volunteers of the Finnish 1st Division. The formation became known after its commander as Detachment Törni. It was not an enormous military force. That was precisely part of its strength. The unit needed to be able to move rapidly. Its men required physical fitness, initiative, and the ability to operate under difficult conditions. Törni participated in selecting his men. He wanted soldiers whom he could trust even when they were operating far from friendly positions. The unit's operations relied on speed and surprise. The men might begin moving under cover of darkness. They advanced on foot or skis. They carried their weapons, ammunition, food, and other essential equipment with them. A mission could take them close to Soviet positions or even behind them. Reconnaissance was an important part of their work. Where was the enemy? How many men did it have? Which roads was it using? Had new forces arrived in the area? Information like this could be more valuable than destroying a single enemy position. But Detachment Törni also carried out combat missions. When a suitable target was found, a small force could strike rapidly and withdraw before the enemy was able to organize an effective response. Törni's style of leadership was practical. He was not a commander who always remained safely behind his men. He personally participated in patrol operations and moved alongside his soldiers. This strengthened his reputation within the unit, but it also made his work dangerous. Törni had already nearly lost his life to a mine. Still, he continued operating near the front. Gradually, the unit developed a strong identity of its own. It even had its own insignia. The emblem featured the letter T with a lightning-like symbol above it. Törni's name began to become known beyond his own unit, but the most famous moments of detachment Törni had not yet taken place in 1943. They were still ahead. In February 1944, a 20-year-old soldier named Mauno Koivisto joined the unit. At the time, nobody could have known that decades later, he would become president of the Republic of Finland. Koivisto was then simply one of Torni's Jaegers, and only a few months later, the fate of Finland would once again hang in the balance. In June 1944, the Soviet Union would launch a massive offensive. The Finnish front would be pushed toward the breaking point, detachment. Törni would then be sent on missions where its mobility and combat effectiveness were needed more than ever before. Lauri Törni's most famous battles were still ahead. Detachment Törni was not an ordinary infantry company. Its missions demanded qualities that were not always required in normal positional warfare. Excellent physical condition, the ability to navigate through difficult terrain, rapid decision-making, and above all, the ability to operate in a small group far from friendly positions. Lauri Törni wanted men around him whom he could trust. Volunteers sought places in the unit, but not everyone was suited to its missions. A patrol could remain in the field for a long time. In addition to weapons and ammunition, the men carried food and other essential equipment. In winter, they moved on skis. In summer, they traveled on foot through forests, marshes, and waterways. After many kilometers, every unnecessary kilogram could be felt. The unit's missions varied. One patrol might be sent to determine the location of enemy positions. Another might observe traffic along a road used by Soviet forces. Sometimes, the objective was to capture a prisoner. During interrogation, a prisoner could provide information about enemy units, their strength and their plans. At other times, a mission developed into direct combat. In those situations, surprise was essential. A small Finnish force could not afford to remain in a prolonged battle against a larger enemy formation. The strike needed to be rapid, then the men withdrew. Törni's style of leadership suited this kind of warfare. He personally participated in dangerous missions. He did not demand that his men go somewhere he was unwilling to go himself. This helped build his reputation among his soldiers. But Törni demanded a great deal from them. The unit had to remain operational, even under difficult conditions. Discipline and trust were essential. Near enemy positions, a single careless sound could reveal an entire patrol. Lighting a fire might be impossible. Lights could not be used freely. Tracks left in the snow had to be considered. Even the return journey could be dangerous. Patrols needed to remember the locations of Finnish minefields and guard positions. Choosing the wrong route could end in disaster. Törni understood that danger personally. He had himself been seriously wounded by a mine in 1942. Still, he continued patrol operations. At the beginning of 1944, Detachment Törni gained a new soldier. His name was Mauno Koivisto. Koivisto had been born in Turku in 1923. He was only 20 years old when he joined Törni's unit. At the time, of course, he was neither a politician nor a president. He was simply another soldier. Koivisto served in Törni's Jaeger company and participated in its battles. Decades later, this detail would become one of the best-known historical connections associated with Detachment Törni. A future president of Finland had served under Lauri Törni. But in early 1944, the men could not know what the future held. The front had remained relatively quiet for a long time. Positional warfare had continued for years. Elsewhere in Europe, however, the war had changed. Germany had suffered enormous losses on the Eastern Front. The Red Army was pushing German forces westward. Soviet military power was growing. Finland's leadership knew that the situation could change rapidly, and in June 1944, it did. The Soviet Union concentrated enormous numbers of troops, artillery, tanks, and aircraft on the Karelian Isthmus. On June 9th, a massive artillery and aerial bombardment began. The following day, the Red Army launched its major offensive. Finnish defensive lines came under tremendous pressure. Years of positional warfare ended within hours. The war also changed for Detachment Törni. Instead of patrols and small raids, its men would soon find themselves involved in battles that were crucial to Finland's survival. The summer of 1944 had begun. In June 1944, Finland's war changed almost overnight. Nearly 3 years earlier, the Finnish army had advanced deep into East Karelia. Afterward, the front had remained relatively stable for a long period, but now the Soviet Union was ready to bring the war toward a conclusion. On June 9, 1944, an enormous artillery and aerial bombardment began on the Karelian Isthmus. The following day, the Red Army launched its major offensive. The Soviet Union concentrated enormous numbers of troops, artillery pieces, tanks, and aircraft. For the attack, Finnish positions came under pressure unlike anything experienced on the front for years. The defenses at Valkeasaari were broken. The Red Army advanced rapidly. Finnish forces withdrew. Viipuri was lost on June 20th. For Törni, the loss of the city was once again personal. Viipuri was his birthplace. Finland had recaptured it in 1941. Now it was lost for a second time. But Törni himself did not fight at Viipuri. He and Detachment Törni were farther north, in the sector of the 1st Division in East Karelia. There, too, the situation changed rapidly. Soviet offensive activity also intensified in East Karelia. The Finnish army had to begin withdrawing from positions it had held for years. For a mobile formation such as Detachment Törni, new missions appeared constantly. Its men could be sent wherever the situation was most dangerous. In June, one such location was a strong point known as Lejona. Soviet artillery struck the area. A dangerous gap developed in the defense, and enemy forces succeeded in capturing the strongpoint. Detachment Törni was ordered to counterattack. Törni's Jaegers advanced toward the lost positions. This was no longer a long reconnaissance patrol behind enemy lines. It was direct combat. The detachment succeeded in recapturing part of the lost positions, but this was only the beginning. The withdrawing Finnish army needed formations capable of reacting rapidly to new threats. Törni's men were well suited to such missions. They had trained to move quickly. They were accustomed to operating independently, and they had experience of close combat and dangerous patrol operations. But during the battles of the summer of 1944, they faced an enemy operating on an entirely different scale. The Red Army was no longer the same force Finland had faced at the beginning of the Winter War. It had fought almost 3 years of extremely difficult warfare against Germany. Its leadership, tactics, and ability to combine artillery, armored forces, and air power had developed considerably. Törni's Jaegers had to operate in the middle of a constantly changing front. Positions were lost. New defensive lines were established. Retreating troops and equipment flowed along the roads. At the same time, The enemy had to be prevented from turning an organized withdrawal into a collapse. In such circumstances, a small but effective reserve force could be extremely important. Detachment Törni was repeatedly sent to difficult sectors. Törni personally led his men. His reputation continued to grow, but casualties grew as well. The detachment was next committed in the Rovaniemi area. There, the situation became extremely dangerous. Finnish troops were threatened with encirclement. Once again, Detachment Törni was sent to assist them. The battle would become one of the unit's hardest. The company would lose almost 1/5 of its strength, but it was precisely because of these battles in the summer of 1944 that Törni's superiors decided once again to recommend him for Finland's highest military distinction, the Mannerheim Cross. This time, the recommendation would be accepted. In the summer of 1944, Lauri Törni's Jaeger company entered a situation that tested the unit more severely than almost any previous mission. The Finnish army was withdrawing from East Karelia. Soviet forces maintained constant pressure on the Finns. The front was moving, positions were changing, and even a small gap in the defense could give the enemy an opportunity to reach the Finnish. Rear Detachment Törni was used as a mobile strike force whenever a dangerous situation developed. Törni's men could be sent rapidly to the threatened sector. One such location was Rovaniemi. Takin. Situation in the area was difficult. Soviet forces had advanced in a way that threatened Finnish positions and withdrawal routes. If the enemy advanced far enough, some Finnish forces could be placed in danger of encirclement. Detachment Törni was ordered to help stabilize the situation. For Törni's men, this once again meant moving directly into combat. They were no longer simply reconnoitering enemy positions. Now, the enemy was directly in front of them. The fighting around Rovaniemi was severe. The forested terrain made the situation confusing. Visibility could be extremely limited. Enemy soldiers might appear at close range before being detected. Artillery fire tore through the forest. Bullets struck trees and the ground. The detachment had to move rapidly while attempting to prevent further Soviet advances. Once again, Törni led his men from close to the action. This was one of the defining characteristics of his leadership. He was not satisfied with observing events from a safe distance. He wanted to know personally what was happening at the front. This strengthened the confidence his soldiers placed in him, but it also meant that Törni exposed himself to many of the same dangers as his men. At Rovaniemi, Detachment Törni paid a heavy price. During the fighting, the company's casualties rose to nearly 1/5 of its strength. Some men were killed, others were wounded. Every lost man mattered greatly in a small unit whose soldiers had come to know one another well. Nevertheless, the detachment remained operational. It participated in counterattacks and helped prevent the situation from becoming even more dangerous. Törni's men had once again demonstrated why they were used in difficult situations. But the battles of the summer of 1944 were not simply stories of successful counterattacks. They were exhausting battles fought during a retreat. The Finnish army was abandoning territory it had held for almost 3 years. The men had to fight while knowing that they might eventually have to withdraw to another position. Törni's own war had changed rapidly. Only a few months earlier, his company had conducted patrols along a relatively stable front. Now the same formation moved from one crisis to another. Törni's actions attracted the attention of his superiors. He had already been recommended for the Mannerheim Cross once before. The first recommendation had not resulted in the award being granted. After the battles of the summer of 1944, the situation changed. Major General Uno Fagernes, commander of the 1st Division, submitted a new recommendation for Törni. The date was July 7, 1944. The recommendation emphasized Törni's courage, leadership, and the achievements of his unit. The decision came quickly. Only 2 days later, on July 9, 1944, the decision was made. Lauri Törni was appointed a Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. His Knight number was 144 for the 25-year-old soldier born in Viipuri had received one of Finland's most distinguished military decorations. But the war was not yet over, and one of Detachment Törni's most famous captures was still ahead. On July 9, 1944, something exceptional happened in Lauri Törni's military career. He was appointed a Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. His Knight number was 144. Törni was 25 years old. Only a few years earlier, he had been a young conscript in the 4th Jaeger Battalion. Since then, he had fought in the Winter War, served as a patrolman and patrol leader, completed reserve officer training, served briefly with the Waffen-SS in Germany, returned to the Continuation War, commanded machine gun and tank platoons, been seriously wounded by a mine, recovered, returned to the front, and eventually been given command of his own Jaeger company. Now, those years of military service resulted in one of Finland's highest military distinctions. The Mannerheim Cross had been established in 1940 as part of the Order of the Cross of Liberty. Military rank was not the deciding factor in receiving it. The cross could be awarded to a soldier who had demonstrated exceptional bravery, achieved particularly important results in combat, or commanded military operations with exceptional distinction. Törni had already been recommended for the Mannerheim Cross earlier. In March 1944, Major General Uno Fagernes, commander of the 1st Division, submitted a recommendation for him. At that time, the cross was not awarded, but the battles of Törni's company continued. During the summer of 1944, Finland's military situation changed rapidly. The Soviet major offensive forced Finnish forces to withdraw. Detachment Törni was used in difficult counterattack and defensive missions. At the Legiona strongpoint, the unit participated in efforts to recapture lost positions. During the fighting at Rovaniemi, its men helped Finnish forces avoid a dangerous encirclement. At the same time, the detachment suffered heavy casualties. On July 7th, Major General Fagernes submitted another recommendation for Törni to receive the Mannerheim Cross. This time, the decision came quickly. 2 days later, the cross was awarded. Lauri Törni became Knight of the Mannerheim Cross number 144. Receiving the distinction did not, however, change his everyday responsibilities. He was still the commander of Detachment Törni. The war continued. His men remained at the front, and the enemy was still facing them. The Mannerheim Cross made Törni better known beyond his own formation. His name became increasingly associated with daring patrol operations and leadership in difficult combat missions. But the legend that later developed around Törni can easily obscure one important fact. He did not achieve these results alone. The effectiveness of detachment. Törni depended on its men, Jaegers, non-commissioned, officers, platoon commanders, medics, and everyone who accompanied Törni on dangerous missions. Some of them never returned. The Mannerheim Cross awarded to Törni was a personal distinction, but behind it were also the achievements and sacrifices of the men he commanded. The summer of 1944 continued. The Soviet offensive had been slowed, but the war was not yet over. Törni continued commanding his company, and just over a month later, his military career would reach another milestone. On August 28, 1944, Lauri Törni was promoted to captain. But at the same time, Finland's leaders were already searching for a way out of the war. Törni did not yet know it, but his war in the Finnish army was approaching its end. Before that happened, however, Detachment Törni would carry out some of its final missions, and one of them would involve a captured piece of equipment that later became one of the detachment's best-known stories. By late July 1944, Finland's war was approaching a decisive stage. Lauri Törni had just been appointed a Knight of the Mannerheim Cross. But at the front, receiving a decoration did not mean that the fighting was over. Quite the opposite. Detachment Törni was needed again. This time, its destination was Ilomantsi. In the forested border region of eastern Finland, the final major battle of the Continuation War was developing. Soviet forces had advanced onto Finnish territory. Their objective was to continue westward and force the Finnish forces to retreat. The Finnish army decided to respond in a way that, in some respects, resembled the Mahdi tactics of the Winter War. Instead of confronting a numerically superior enemy everywhere in a continuous frontal battle, Finnish forces attempted to cut supply routes and isolate enemy formations from one another. The terrain favored this kind of warfare. The Ilomantsi region was filled with forests, marshes, lakes, and relatively few roads. The movement of large formations depended heavily on the road network. This made their flanks and supply routes vulnerable. It was precisely this kind of environment in which Detachment Törni was at its strongest. Törni's company was transferred from the Tolvajärvi sector to Ilomantsi. The young Mauno Koivisto was among its soldiers. Törni's men were assigned missions across much of the Ilomantsi front. They moved through the wilderness. They carried out rapid attacks. They searched for scattered Soviet soldiers, and they captured prisoners. Reconnaissance was once again essential. Finnish commanders needed to know where Soviet forces were moving and which routes they were using. Törni's men could operate in areas where larger formations would have been slow and easily detected. The Battle of Ilomantsi was not one clearly defined engagement. It was a series of battles fought across an enormous forested area. Units moved in different directions. Communications were broken. Supply became difficult, and information about the enemy's location could be incomplete. For a small, experienced, and highly mobile unit, this created opportunities, but it also created enormous dangers. Törni's men could find themselves far away from other Finnish formations. The enemy might be ahead of them, beside them, or behind them. Every mission required accurate navigation and constant assessment of the situation. The detachment conducted attacks against pockets of Soviet troops and scattered enemy formations. Prisoners were brought back for interrogation. At the same time, Törni's men helped maintain pressure on Soviet supply and communication routes. But Detachment Törni was only one part of a much larger Finnish force, fighting at Ilomantsi. The outcome of the battle cannot be attributed to a single company. The Finnish operation depended on the combined efforts of several formations. Törni's company was one small but highly mobile part of that larger operation. As August progressed, the Soviet offensive lost momentum. Finnish forces had succeeded in stopping the advance. The Soviet formations eventually withdrew eastward. Ilomantsi became the final major Finnish-Soviet battle of the continuation war. For Törni, it was also the culmination of one phase of his Finnish military career. He had entered the Winter War as a young soldier. Now he commanded his own company in one of the final major battles of the continuation war. On August 28, 1944, Lauri Törni was promoted to captain. He was 25 years old, but at the same time, the Finnish government was negotiating a way out of the war. At the beginning of September, an order arrived that changed everything. A ceasefire between Finland and the Soviet Union was about to begin. Detachment Törni's war against the Soviet Union was coming to an end. But for Lauri Törni, peace would prove far more complicated than simply putting down his weapons. On September 4, 1944, Detachment Törni had marched back to the Tolvajärvi area. Then a message reached the company headquarters. The ceasefire between Finland and the Soviet Union would take effect at 7 o'clock the following morning. For Törni's men, the news represented an enormous change. They had spent years at war. Many had participated in dangerous patrol missions, counterattacks, and the heavy withdrawal battles of the summer of 1944. Now the shooting was supposed to stop. On the evening of September 4th, Lauri Törni assembled his company. He presented the final decorations and promotions. Detachment Törni's war against the Soviet Union was coming to an end. The following morning, the ceasefire took effect, but peace with the Soviet Union did not mean that Finland's war was completely over. The terms imposed on Finland rapidly transformed its position. Finland had to break its relationship with Germany, and German forces, still remaining inside the country, had to leave. A large number of German troops were stationed in northern Finland. Former brothers in arms were becoming enemies. The Lapland War began. Finnish forces now had to fight the Germans and push them north toward Norway. Lauri Törni wanted to participate. War had occupied virtually his entire adult life. He had entered military service in 1938. Then came the Winter War, military service during the interim peace, and the continuation war. Within only a few years, Törni had risen from conscript to captain. He had received the Mannerheim Cross, and he had commanded his own battle-hardened Jaeger company. Now, he was expected to leave the war behind. Törni wanted to take his men north to fight in the Lapland War, but his superiors disagreed. Lieutenant Colonel Lars Rundqvist and General Uno Fagernes believed that the company had already done enough. Too many of Törni's men had been killed. The unit would not be sent into another war. In practice, this marked the end of the story of detachment. Törni. A total of 239 men had served as Törnis. Jaegers. 3 members of the Lotta organization and 2 military dogs had also served with the unit. Though formation had brought together Finnish men from widely different backgrounds, what united them was that they had volunteered and served under Törni's command. Now the men went their separate ways. For many, the return to civilian life began. For Törni, that transition was more difficult. On November 3, 1944, Lauri Törni was released from Finnish Army service. He was 25 years old. Behind him was an almost uninterrupted military career stretching back to 1938. Suddenly, he had no unit to command, no patrol, no front, no next military assignment. At the same time, Finland was living through a period of profound uncertainty. Soviet influence had increased dramatically. The Allied control commission arrived to supervise Finland's compliance with the armistice. The Finnish army was being demobilized. Some Finnish officers continued to fear the possibility of a Soviet occupation. A secret weapons caching operation was organized in Finland as a precaution against such a scenario. For Törni, this uncertainty would lead even further. He was not ready to leave the life of a soldier behind. During the winter of 1944 and 1945, he became involved in a plan that would take him outside Finland once again. His destination was the same country he had visited in 1941, Germany. But the world was now completely different. Germany was losing the war. The Red Army was approaching from the east. The Western Allies were advancing from the west. The Third Reich was collapsing. Yet, in January 1945, Lauri Törni began a journey toward Germany. That decision would permanently change his life. And this time, he was no longer a Finnish army officer sent abroad in the circumstances of 1941. Törni was entering an extremely dangerous path that would later also have serious legal consequences. In November 1944, Lauri Törni's career in the Finnish army had ended, but his own war had not. Finland's situation remained uncertain. An armistice had been concluded with the Soviet Union, and the Allied Control Commission was operating in Finland. At the same time, some Finnish officers were preparing for the worst. What if the Soviet Union occupied Finland? This fear contributed, among other things, to the secret weapons caching operation organized in Finland. Törni also believed that another struggle against the Soviet Union might still become necessary. During the winter of 1944 and 1945, an opportunity appeared for him to receive additional training for such a possibility. Finns were being secretly recruited for training in Germany. The operation was connected with the German intelligence organization. Sonderkommando Nord. Törni decided to join. The decision was completely different from his first journey to Germany in 1941. At that time, Finland and Germany had been moving closer together before the beginning of the continuation war. Now the situation was the opposite. Finland had broken relations with Germany. Finnish and German troops were fighting one another in Lapland. Germany was therefore an enemy of Finland. Despite this, Törni secretly departed for Germany in January 1945. The journey took place under extraordinary circumstances. Törni traveled to Germany aboard a submarine. His purpose was to receive training in preparation for the possibility that the Soviet Union might occupy Finland and a resistance movement would have to be organized. In Germany, Törni received training in intelligence and sabotage operations. The idea was to prepare men who could operate behind enemy lines in an occupied Finland. But the assumption behind the plan rapidly began losing its relevance. The Soviet Union did not occupy Finland. The Finnish state remained independent. At the same time, Germany's own situation became catastrophic. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. In the east, the Red Army was advancing toward Berlin. In the west, American, British, and other Western Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany. German defeat was now only a matter of time. Törni found himself in the middle of a collapsing state. In April 1945, his situation changed once again. He was offered the possibility of returning to Finland through Norway. The proposed mission would have involved organizing intelligence and sabotage activities. Törni refused to operate against Finland. That decision had consequences. Instead of returning to his homeland, he was sent to the front. Törni received a German military uniform. He was given the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer. This was approximately equivalent to the rank of captain. The Finnish Knight of the Mannerheim Cross had therefore become an officer, serving in the German forces once again during the final weeks of the war. This time, he would also enter actual combat. Törni was given command of a German formation numbering several hundred men. But amid the chaos of the final stage of the war, his objective was already changing. Törni knew that Germany was losing. He and his companions wanted to reach the West. If surrender was inevitable, they wanted to surrender to the Americans or British, not to the Soviet Red Army. But the route west was not open. Near the Haguenau airfield, Törni and his men found themselves surrounded by the Red Army. Ahead lay one of his final battles of the Second World War. The Finnish officer who had begun his war in the forests of the Winter War in 1939 was now fighting 6 years later on Germany's collapsing front, and this time, his most important objective was no longer victory. It was reaching the Western Allies alive. In the spring of 1945, Lauri Törni found himself in the middle of a collapsing Germany. The situation was completely different from his first journey to Germany in 1941. At that time, the German army had been preparing for its enormous invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, 4 years later, the Third Reich was being destroyed. The Red Army was advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. German cities lay in ruins. Millions of soldiers and civilians were moving westward, attempting to escape the approaching Red Army. Torni had the same objective. He wanted to reach the west. In Germany, Törni had received the rank of SS Hauptsturmführer and a German military uniform. During the final phase of the war, he was given command of a German formation numbering several hundred men. Törni was once again a commander, but his mission was now very different from the missions he had led in the Finnish forests. The war could no longer be won. Survival had become the priority. Törni and his Finnish companions had already decided that they would attempt to reach the Western Allies. They did not want to become prisoners of the Red Army. Near the Haguenau airfield, the situation became dangerous. Soviet forces surrounded the formation commanded by Törni. Törni and his men were forced into battle. The German soldiers under his command were now caught between two enormous armies. To the east were the Soviet forces. To the west were the Americans. Törni attempted to keep his formation together and move westward. The situation became so unusual that Törni's force received ammunition from the Americans during the fighting. A German formation was therefore fighting the Red Army, while the Americans approaching from the west were effectively about to become its captors. Törni knew there was no longer any reason to continue fighting indefinitely. Once he had gathered his men together, he made his decision. Törni surrendered to the Americans. The Soviet forces protested. They wanted Törni and his men transferred into their custody, but Törni had achieved what he had intended. He had reached the Western Allies. The Second World War in Europe ended in May 1945. For Lauri Törni, it meant that for the first time he was a prisoner of the enemy. He was taken into the Allied prisoner of war. System Törni was now in a difficult position. He was a Finnish citizen. He was a knight of the Mannerheim Cross and a captain of the Finnish army. But he had also served in the German armed forces in 1945, at a time when Finland and Germany were at war with one another. If he returned to Finland, there would be consequences. Törni, however, had no intention of remaining a prisoner of war. He managed to escape. Ahead lay a long and dangerous journey north. His objective was to return to Finland. The man who only months earlier had secretly traveled to Germany aboard a submarine was now making his way home through the ruins of Europe. But a hero's welcome was not waiting for him in Finland. His journey to Germany in 1945 had completely changed his legal position. The Finnish authorities became interested in Törni, and soon the Knight of the Mannerheim Cross would experience something he had never faced even during the worst years of the war, arrest, interrogation, trial, and prison. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Lauri Törni had once again survived. But this time, he could not simply return home as an officer of the Finnish army. He had secretly left Finland for Germany at a time when Finland and Germany were already enemies. He had received military training in Germany, and during the final weeks of the war, he had served with German forces. Now Törni was a prisoner of the Western Allies. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp. But Törni had no intention of remaining there. He managed to escape. A long journey north began. Post-war Europe was in chaos. Millions of people were on the move. Prisoners of war were being released and transferred. Refugees were attempting to find their way home. Cities and transportation networks had been destroyed in many areas. Amid this confusion, Törni attempted to make his way back towards Scandinavia. Eventually, he succeeded in reaching Sweden. From there, his journey continued to Finland. By August 1945, Lauri Törni was back in his homeland, but the Finland to which he returned was very different from the country. He had left in January. The war was over. The Lapland War had ended. The Allied Control Commission was still operating in Finland. Finns connected with Germany, and wartime activities were being investigated. Törni's actions also attracted the attention of the authorities. His journey to Germany in 1945 was particularly problematic. When Törni had left Finland, the country was already at war with Germany. His actions could, therefore, be interpreted as service on behalf of an enemy state. Törni attempted to avoid the authorities, but his freedom was short-lived. The Finnish state police, Valpo, the predecessor of the later Security Intelligence Service, was searching for him. Törni was arrested. The Knight of the Mannerheim Cross and former Finnish army captain was now a prisoner of the Finnish security police. The situation was extraordinary. Only a year earlier, Törni had been a decorated Finnish soldier and company commander. Now he had to explain why he had traveled to an enemy country and served there. But Törni's story took another turn. He did not remain in custody. Torni managed to escape from Valpo detention. Once again, he went into hiding. The authorities searched for him. Eventually, Törni was captured again. This time, the case moved toward trial. The charges were serious. Törni's activities in Germany in 1945 were treated as treason. From the perspective of his defense, his intention had been to prepare for a possible Soviet occupation and ultimately to defend Finland. Legally, however, the crucial issue was that he had traveled to Germany and served in German forces while Finland and Germany were at war. In 1946, Lauri Törni was sentenced to 6 years of imprisonment for treason. He also temporarily lost his civic rights. Törni was 27 years old. Within only a few years, he had traveled an extraordinary path, from conscript to soldier, from soldier to officer, from officer to knight of the Mannerheim Cross, and now, from decorated soldier to prisoner. But even prison walls would not ultimately keep Törni in one place. He would attempt to escape again, more than once, and eventually, his case would reach the desk of the President of Finland himself. After the war, Lauri Törni's life had changed completely. Only a few years earlier, he had commanded his own Jaeger company at the front. He had been awarded the Mannerheim Cross. He had been promoted to captain. Now he stood before the Finnish justice system, accused of treason. At the center of the case was Törni's journey to Germany in 1945. When he left Finland, Finland and Germany were at war with one another. Törni had received training in Germany and, during the final phase of the war, had once again entered German military service. From Törni's own perspective, his actions were primarily connected with preparing for a possible struggle against a Soviet occupation. From the perspective of Finnish law, however, the crucial fact was that he had served in the armed forces of an enemy state. On January 10, 1947, Törni was sentenced to 6 years of imprisonment for treason. He also temporarily lost his civic rights. The Knight of the Mannerheim Cross was now a prisoner, but prison did not change one of Törni's most recognizable characteristics. He did not like remaining in one place, and he did not easily accept other people. Controlling his movements, Törni attempted to escape from custody several times. He also succeeded in getting beyond the prison walls. Of his best-known escapes took place from Turku Provincial Prison. Törni escaped together with another prisoner. His freedom, however, was temporary. The authorities captured him again. Törni's escape attempts fitted the reputation he had developed during the war. He was accustomed to moving through difficult terrain. He was accustomed to taking risks, and he was accustomed to solving problems through action. But after the war, there was no enemy front line to cross. This time, he was confronting the Finnish state. Törni's case produced conflicting reactions. To some, he was a knight of the Mannerheim Cross and an exceptionally courageous soldier who had spent years fighting for Finland. From another perspective, his decision in 1945 presented a straightforward legal problem. Finland was at war with Germany, and Törni had traveled to Germany and served in its armed forces. Post-war Finland was itself passing through a difficult period. The country had to carefully manage its relationship with the Soviet Union. War reparations were being paid, and the armed forces had been reduced to peacetime strength. And many decisions made during the war were being examined in a new political and legal environment. For a man like Törni, this world was very different from the one in which he had spent almost his entire adult life. He no longer had a company. There was no front. There was no military mission. He was not yet 30 years old. But behind him were already 2 wars in the Finnish army and 2 separate periods of service in Germany. Ultimately, Törni did not serve the full original sentence. At the end of 1948, his case reached the President of the Republic. President J.K. Paasikivi decided to pardon him. On December 23, 1948, Lauri Törni was released. He was once again a free man, but his position in Finland had changed permanently. A military career in the Finnish army was effectively closed to him. The treason conviction followed. Him and post-war Finland offered few opportunities. To a man whose adult life had been built almost entirely around military service, Törni now had to decide what to do next. Gradually, an answer began to emerge. If he could not build another military career in Finland, perhaps he could do so somewhere else. In 1949, Törni made a decision that would begin an entirely new chapter of his life. He decided to leave Finland. Another secret journey lay ahead, but this time, his destination was not Germany. The route would first take him to Sweden, then across the Atlantic, and eventually to the country where Lauri Törni would acquire a new name, Larry Thorne. In December 1948, Lauri Törni was once again a free man. President J.K. Paasikivi had pardoned him, but freedom did not solve Törni's greatest problem. What would he do with his life? In Finland, his chances of continuing a military career had effectively disappeared. He was a knight of the Mannerheim Cross and an experienced officer, but he also carried a conviction for treason. Törni was only 29 years old, yet almost his entire adult life had been spent in the military and at war. Civilian life did not seem to offer him a place. So Törni once again began looking beyond Finland's borders. In February 1949, he made his decision. Törni left Finland together with Holger Pitkänen. He did not travel using an ordinary passport. Törni used a false seaman's passport. Their destination was Sweden. Near Stockholm, Törni and Pitkänen received help from Countess Vera von Essen. She had also assisted other Finnish soldiers who had moved to Sweden after the war. Törni had therefore found his first safe base outside Finland. In Sweden, his life also took a very different turn. Törni met a young Finnish woman named Marja Kops. He moved in with the Kops family in Saltsjö-Duvnäs near Stockholm. For the first time in a long while, Törni's life contained something that had nothing to do with war. Lauri and Marja fell in love. On New Year's Day 1950, they became engaged. For a time, it may have appeared that Törni would remain in Sweden and begin an ordinary civilian life. But one problem remained. Törni wanted to support himself and his future family, and the profession he truly understood was soldiering. His attention turned toward the United States. The American military offered a possibility that no longer existed for him in Finland, but reaching the United States would not be simple. Törni had no ordinary route to immigration. So once again, he decided to use life at sea as a way forward. In March 1950, Törni signed aboard a ship bound for Venezuela. He left Sweden and Marja Kops behind. The journey carried him across the Atlantic to South America. But Törni had no intention of remaining permanently in Venezuela. He searched for another ship. Eventually, he signed aboard a Norwegian vessel. The ship departed Venezuela and headed toward North America. Törni was now closer than ever to his true destination, the United States. But he still had no legal permission to enter the country. In September 1950, the Norwegian vessel was off the southern coast of the United States near Mobile, Alabama. Törni made his decision. He did not wait for the ship to enter port. Under cover of darkness, he jumped from the vessel into the sea. Ahead was a swim toward the American shore. Törni reached land. Lauri Törni had arrived in the United States, but completely illegally. He did not possess the proper immigration documents. He was not an American citizen, and he could not yet join the United States Army. Another uncertain period followed. Törni traveled to New York. There he found the Finnish-American community. Other Finns helped him. Törni worked various jobs while waiting for his legal status to be resolved. He had traveled an extraordinary distance. From Viipuri to the Winter War, from the Winter War to the Continuation War, from the Finnish army to Germany, from Germany to prison, from prison to Sweden, from Sweden to Venezuela, and from Venezuela to the United States. But his objective was not simply to reach America. Törni wanted to return to the military. It would take more than 3 years. Finally, on January 28, 1954, his goal was achieved. At the age of 34, Lauri Törni enlisted in the United States Army. The knight of the Mannerheim Cross had to begin again from the bottom. He was once again an ordinary recruit, but the Americans did not yet know what kind of soldier had just entered their ranks. On January 28, 1954, Lauri Törni began his military career once again, but this time, he was not wearing the uniform of the Finnish army. He enlisted in the United States Army. Törni was 34 years old. Most of the recruits around him were considerably younger, and on paper, Törni was starting at exactly the same level as they were. His military rank was private. The situation was almost absurd. A man who had risen to the rank of captain in Finland, a man who had commanded his own Jaeger company, a man who had been awarded the Mannerheim Cross, and a man with years of combat experience behind him was once again an ordinary recruit. But Törni accepted the situation. If he wanted to return to the profession of soldiering, he had to begin again. His name also began to change. Lauri Törni started using the Americanized name Lauri Thorne. In addition to a new army, he faced a new language and a new culture. The basic skills of soldiering, however, were nothing new to him. Physical hardship was not a problem. Handling weapons was not a problem. Operating in difficult terrain was not a problem. One of Törni's greatest challenges was the English language. He had to learn American commands and military terminology while completing his training. But his previous experience was quickly noticed. A number of Finnish officers who had left Finland after the war were already serving in the United States Army. They later became known as Martinins. Men, the name came from Colonel Alpo Martinin. Several of these Finns had combat experience against the Soviet Union in Cold War America. That experience had considerable value. The United States and the Soviet Union were now the world's two great opposing powers. If another war erupted in Europe, American planners had to prepare for the possibility that Soviet forces could advance deep into Western Europe. In such a war, soldiers capable of operating behind enemy lines would be needed: reconnaissance, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, survival, independent operations by small units. These were things Törni had already done in Finland. The Americans continued his training. He received mountaineering instruction. He studied communications, and he volunteered for airborne training. Törni completed U.S. Army airborne training and earned his parachutist wings. The 34-year-old Finnish combat veteran was once again developing into an elite soldier. His rank began to rise. In December 1954, Törni was promoted to private first class. In April 1955, he became a corporal. By November, he was already a sergeant. His rise from the lowest enlisted rank had been rapid, but an even more important change was taking place in his assignments. Törni entered the world of the United States Army Special Forces. Special Forces was still a young organization. Its missions were almost perfectly suited to Törni's previous experience. Special Forces soldiers needed to operate in small teams far from friendly forces. They needed to be capable of training others, surviving under difficult conditions, operating in mountains and forests, and, if necessary, organizing resistance inside enemy-controlled territory. Törni did not enter this world as an inexperienced student. He also had skills to teach the Americans. He instructed soldiers in areas including skiing, survival, mountaineering, and guerrilla warfare. Skills learned in the forests of Finland had found a new purpose. On the other side of the Atlantic, Törni's life was once again built around the profession of soldiering. But one crucial step remained. He was still a non-commissioned officer. In Finland, he had been a captain. If Törni wanted to become an officer again, he would have to earn that position within the American military system. That opportunity soon appeared. Törni obtained United States citizenship. He was then able to progress into officer training. In January 1957, he was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the United States Army. Only 3 years earlier, he had started as a private. Now Lauri Thorne was an officer once again, and soon his path would take him back to Europe, to West Germany, to the foothills of the Alps, to the 10th Special Forces Group. There, the Finnish patrol commander would become one of the experienced Cold War soldiers of the United States Army Special Forces. In 1954, Lauri Törni had begun his career in the United States Army once again as a private. Within only a few years, his position had changed completely. The Finnish war veteran had become Lauri Thorne, and the ordinary recruit was becoming an officer in the United States Army Special Forces. Törni's previous military experience was exceptionally well suited to what the United States Army needed during the Cold War. Special Forces was still a relatively young organization. Its purpose was not simply to fight conventional infantry battles. Special Forces soldiers needed to be capable of operating in small teams deep inside enemy-controlled territory. They needed to train local forces, gather intelligence, organize resistance, lead guerrilla forces, and survive for extended periods without the support available to conventional troops. Törni had already practiced many of these skills in Finland. The patrols of Detachment Törni had moved through forests in small groups. Törni had led his men through difficult terrain. He knew how to ski, navigate, and survive in cold conditions. He also possessed genuine combat experience against Soviet forces. In the atmosphere of the Cold War during the 1950s, this made him particularly interesting to the Americans. The most important potential enemy of the United States was now the same great power Törni had fought against for years, the Soviet Union. Törni continued his training. He completed airborne training. He received mountaineering instruction. He studied military communications, and gradually, he moved closer to the missions for which the United States Army Special Forces had been created. But Törni was not simply a student. His Finnish military experience was also valuable to others. Especially under winter conditions, he possessed experience that many American soldiers did not have. Skiing, movement through deep snow, survival in freezing temperatures, using terrain to advantage, and leading small units under difficult conditions. These skills became part of Lauri Thorne's new military identity. In 1957, a decisive change occurred. Thorne received the opportunity to become an officer again. He was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the United States Army. In Finland, he had once been a captain. In America, he had been forced to begin again from the bottom. But now he once again held an officer's rank. Soon, Thorne was assigned to the 10th Special Forces Group. The unit had an extremely important mission in Cold War Europe. Its base was located at Bad Tölz in West Germany. The Alps were only a relatively short distance away, and much farther to the east ran the frontier dividing Europe into two opposing camps, the NATO West and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc, if a third. World War had erupted in Europe. Soldiers of the 10th Special Forces Group would have faced extremely dangerous missions. They could be inserted behind enemy lines. There, they would have been expected to establish contact with local resistance movements, gather intelligence, and organize guerrilla warfare. Lauri Thorne was almost perfectly suited to such an environment. He already knew the Soviet soldier as an enemy from personal experience. He knew how to operate in forests and mountains. He had commanded small raiding forces, and he had spent much of his adult life in situations where survival depended on independent decision-making. At Bad Tölz, Thorne also returned to the mountains. Mountain operations became one of his specialties. He trained with his men in difficult alpine terrain, climbing, skiing, survival, and military operations in areas where conventional vehicle-based forces could not easily operate. Among American Special Forces soldiers, Thorne developed a reputation as an extremely tough and experienced soldier. His English was not perfect. His personality could be reserved, but in the field, his experience was obvious. Törni's life had once again come full circle. He had begun his military career in the forests of Finland. Now he was training American soldiers in Europe for a possible war against the Soviet Union. But in 1959, Lauri Thorne would be given a mission that would make his name known within the United States Army as well. An aircraft had crashed in the mountains of Iran. An American military aircraft had gone down on a difficult mountain. Previous attempts to reach the wreck had failed. Then the mission was given to Lauri Thorne. Ahead lay one of the most famous operations of his American military career. On January 27, 1962, a U.S. Army U-1A Otter aircraft took off from Tehran, Iran. Its destination was Dezful, approximately 300 miles to the southwest. 5 U.S. Army soldiers were aboard. During the flight, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Over the Zagros Mountains, the aircraft encountered a severe snowstorm. Visibility decreased. The surrounding mountains rose more than 3 kilometers above sea level. Shortly before noon, the aircraft crashed into a snow-covered mountain ridge at an altitude of approximately 12,500 feet. The impact was violent. The aircraft lost a wing and eventually came to rest upside down in the snow. But something remarkable had happened. All 5 men aboard survived the initial crash. They were, however, injured and stranded in a winter mountain environment. Temperatures were below freezing. The snow was deep, and a blizzard was raging around them. The men left the aircraft and attempted to descend to a lower altitude. That decision would prove fatal for some of them. A rescue operation began quickly. Iranian mountain troops were sent into the region. Aircraft searched for the missing men. Helicopters were also employed, but the weather and terrain of the Zagros Mountains made the operation extremely difficult. 2 of the men were eventually found alive. 3 remained missing. The wreckage also remained high on the mountain. Months passed. Snow continued to cover the region. Previous attempts to locate the missing men and fully reach the wreck had failed to complete the mission. In May 1962, the United States Army decided to use Special Forces. The mission was assigned to the 10th Special Forces Group based in West Germany. Captain Herbert Chandler was appointed mission commander. Captain Lauri Thorne was selected as his second-in-command. Thorne was almost a natural choice for the assignment. He had years of experience skiing and operating in winter conditions. He had received mountain training in the United States Army. He had trained in the Alps, and he had completed training with the Italian Alpini. Thorne and the other Special Forces soldiers flew to Iran. Their first challenge was determining how they could even reach the wreck. Maps of the region were limited. Snow still covered the mountains. Equipment had to be transported over long distances through difficult terrain. Part of the journey was made on foot. Local people and pack animals were also used to move supplies. In early June, the team reached the high mountain area. The aircraft wreckage was found lying upside down in the snow. Now the most difficult phase of the operation began. The bodies of the missing soldiers had to be located. At the same time, militarily, important equipment and material had to be recovered from the aircraft. Thorne worked high on the mountain with a small group. On June 8th, the first 2 bodies were discovered in the area. The cold conditions had preserved them for months. Finding the 3rd man proved more difficult. The soldiers systematically searched the snow and surrounding terrain. Meanwhile, the conditions began affecting the rescuers themselves. Thorne and his companions were operating at elevations reaching approximately 14,500 feet. The air was thin. At night, Thorne and Master Sergeant Charles Rhodes began suffering from the effects of altitude. Lying down made breathing difficult. The 2 men were forced to spend the night sitting upright, struggling to get enough oxygen. Still, the operation continued. Radios and flight instruments were removed from the aircraft. Equipment was cataloged. The search for the missing men continued. Eventually, the 3rd body was also recovered. A mission that had involved months of unsuccessful search efforts was finally completed. On June 18th, the Special Forces team began its return. Lauri Thorne and the other soldiers had successfully completed one of the 10th Special Forces Group's first significant operational missions. The importance of the operation extended beyond recovering the wreckage of a single aircraft. It demonstrated that U.S. Army Special Forces could operate far from their home bases and under extremely difficult conditions. Thorne's reputation grew. Experience that had begun in the forests of Finland, winter survival, navigation, and small unit operations had once again proved valuable. But the mountains of Iran were only an intermediate stage. On the other side of the world, a conflict was developing that would come to define an entire American generation. Vietnam, and Lauri Thorne wanted to go there. In 1963, his request was approved. Ahead lay his first deployment to Southeast Asia. This time, there would be no snow or freezing cold. There would be jungle. In November 1963, Lauri Thorne once again entered a war. This time, the environment was completely different from anything he had experienced before. There were no snow-covered Finnish forests, no ruined German cities, no frozen Iranian mountains. Ahead lay South Vietnam. Tropical heat, rice paddies, jungle, rivers and canals, and an enemy that was often almost impossible to distinguish from the surrounding population. Thorne was now a captain in the United States Army and a Green Beret. He arrived in the country with Special Forces Detachment A734. At this stage, American involvement in the Vietnam War was still very different from what it would become only a few years later. Large American combat formations had not yet been deployed on the scale that would later make the war known throughout the world. The American mission was primarily to advise, train, and support South Vietnamese forces. Special forces played an important role in this effort. Green Berets were sent to remote areas to establish camps and train local forces. One of the most important programs was the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CIDG. Its purpose was to train local armed forces to defend villages and territory against Viet Cong activity. Thorne and A734 were deployed to the Mekong Delta region. They initially operated around Chau Lang. Later, their most important base became Tin Bien. Tin Bien was located close to the Cambodian border. The area was strategically important. Across the border, the Viet Cong could use Cambodian territory for movement, supply, and sanctuary. Thorne quickly discovered that warfare in Vietnam required a different way of thinking. The enemy usually did not form a clearly defined front line. The Viet Cong could move in small groups. They could strike at night and disappear before dawn. Among the local population could be both supporters of the South Vietnamese government and supporters of the Viet Cong. Intelligence was enormously important. But this was precisely the kind of warfare in which Thorne possessed considerable experience. He had spent much of his military career working with small units, patrols, ambushes, reconnaissance, rapid strikes, operating close to the enemy without constant support from a large conventional army. Now the same principles were being applied in the jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. Thorne did not spend all of his time inside the camp. He participated in patrols and operations with his men and local forces. His mission was also to train them. Local soldiers were taught how to use their weapons, how to patrol, how to conduct ambushes, how to defend the camp, and how to operate in an environment where the enemy could attack from almost any direction. During 1964, A734 moved to Tin Bien. The camp was located near the Cambodian border in the Seven Mountains region. Thorne knew the position was dangerous. The camp was still being constructed while Viet Cong forces operated in the surrounding area. The defenses were strengthened. Sandbags were stacked. Barbed wire surrounded the camp. Machine gun positions were established at important points along the defensive perimeter. But Thorne also suspected that the enemy had successfully infiltrated the local forces. This made the situation even more dangerous. The enemy might be receiving information about the camp's defenses from inside. Thorne prepared for an attack. He did not know exactly when it would come, but he believed it was inevitable. At the same time, an American author named Robin Moore arrived at the camp. Moore was gathering material for a book about the United States Army Special Forces. He ended up observing Thorne and the other Green Berets at close range. Moore later published the novel, The Green Berets. One of the characters in the book was a Finnish-sounding Special Forces officer named Sven Korni. Lauri Thorne was an important inspiration for the character. The book would later also be adapted into a film starring John Wayne. But in 1964, Thorne was not thinking about books or movies. His problem was far more immediate. The Tin Bien camp was not yet completely finished. The Viet Cong knew it, and the enemy was preparing to attack. When the attack finally came, the battle became one of the fiercest engagements of Lauri Thorne's first tour in Vietnam. The Viet Cong succeeded in penetrating the defensive positions. Fighting took place at close range. Thorne was wounded, but the camp did not fall. As a result of the fighting, Thorne would receive the Bronze Star for valor, as well as Purple Hearts for wounds suffered in combat. Lauri Törni had now fought in the armed forces of 3 different countries: Finland, Germany, and the United States. But the Battle of Tin Bien was only beginning. In the next part, we will examine what happened at the camp on the night when the Viet Cong attempted to destroy Thorne's force. In the spring of 1964, Captain Larry Thorne was serving in South Vietnam in the middle of a rapidly changing war. His Special Forces detachment had moved to Tin Bien near the Cambodian border. It was a dangerous location. The camp stood in an area where the Viet Cong could operate relatively close to the border and use the surrounding terrain to their advantage. When American author Robin Moore arrived in the area in May 1964, the Tin Bien camp was still incomplete. Defensive positions were being constructed, sandbags were being stacked, barbed wire surrounded the area, machine gun positions were being prepared. Thorne knew that the security of the camp could not be taken for granted. Of particular concern was the reliability of the local forces. Hundreds of local fighters were based at Tin Bien. Some were Vietnamese and others Cambodian. Thorne reported to higher headquarters that the Viet Cong had succeeded in infiltrating these forces. This meant that the enemy might be obtaining information about the camp's operations and defenses. Thorne did not simply wait. The forces under his command conducted active operations throughout the surrounding region. Patrols searched for Viet Cong forces. Intelligence was gathered, and enemy activity was disrupted before it could develop into a direct threat to the camp. One of Thorne's known operations involved Viet Cong forces believed to be preparing for action against Tin Bien. Armed Cambodian groups were also operating in the region. Their loyalties were questionable. Thorne decided to exploit the tensions between the different armed groups in the area. He positioned forces in ways designed to pressure the Viet Cong and restrict their movement. Thorne also led local fighters in an attack against a Viet Cong position. The Viet Cong withdrew. During their retreat, they encountered other armed groups operating in the area. A confused battle followed. Thorne's objective had been to reduce the enemy's ability to threaten the unfinished Tin Bien camp. The operation illustrates his way of thinking. He did not want to wait for the enemy to take the initiative. He attempted to gather information, anticipate enemy movements, and act before the opposing force could execute its own plan. At this point, however, the story of Tin Bien contains an important distinction between history and later legend. Robin Moore used Thorne's experiences as material for his book, The Green Berets. The book included a Finnish-born Special Forces officer whose character was based on Larry Thorne. Moore changed names, locations, and events. He combined real experiences into a dramatic narrative. In the book, the character based on Thorne defends a camp against a massive Viet Cong attack. The enemy breaks through the defenses. Machine gun positions are captured, and the defenders are forced to fight as the camp comes close to being overrun. The story became famous. Similar scenes later appeared in the John Wayne film The Green Berets, but the historical record appears to tell a different story. Field reports from Detachment A-734 at Tin Bien do not confirm that the camp experienced the massive attack described in the book while Thorne was there. Moore appears to have combined the events at Tin Bien with elements of battles fought elsewhere in Vietnam. One particularly important example was the Battle of Nam Dong. On June 6, 1964, the Viet Cong attacked the Special Forces camp at Nam Dong in central Vietnam. There, American and Allied defenders really did face a major battle for their camp. Larry Thorne, however, did not command the defense of Nam Dong. For this reason, the famous large-scale night battle at Tin Bien should not be presented as a confirmed event in Thorne's biography. Thorne's real first tour in Vietnam does not need the legend to be remarkable. He led patrols. He participated in counterinsurgency operations. He planned ambushes. He defended remote camps. He trained local forces, and he operated in an environment where anticipating the enemy's movements could determine the success or failure of an entire operation. His superiors and his men particularly respected his meticulous planning. Thorne did not build a plan around the assumption that everything would go right. He also considered what would happen when something went wrong. That ability rested on more than 2 decades of military experience. During his first tour in Vietnam, Thorne was wounded. He received 2 Purple Hearts. He was also awarded the Bronze Star Medal for valor. During 1964, his first Vietnam tour came to an end, but Thorne had not seen Vietnam for the last time. He would return. And during his second tour, his missions would become even more secretive and dangerous. Lauri Thorne was heading toward MACV-SOG, an organization whose operations remained classified for many years, and there, the final chapter of his life would begin. In 1965, Lauri Thorne returned to Vietnam. He was now 46 years old, an age when most soldiers were no longer volunteering for the most dangerous assignments available. Thorne was different. His first tour in Vietnam had ended in 1964. He could have continued his career as an instructor or in more conventional special forces assignments. Instead, he returned to war. By May 1965, Thorne was once again in South Vietnam. But the war was changing rapidly. The United States was expanding its military presence. American combat forces were pouring into the country. North Vietnam, meanwhile, was moving increasing numbers of men, weapons, and supplies toward the south. One of the most important parts of this system became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was not a single road. It was an enormous network of trails, roads, waterways, supply depots, and bases. Much of the network passed through Laos and later Cambodia. It allowed North Vietnam to support its forces fighting in the south. For the Americans, this presented an enormous problem. The supply network had to be monitored. They needed to determine where enemy troops were moving, where trucks were traveling, where supply depots were located, and how many men and how much material were moving toward South Vietnam, conventional. Intelligence could not always provide the answers. Men were needed on the ground, men who could be secretly inserted into areas where the United States was not officially supposed to be conducting a ground war. For this purpose, there was MACV-SOG. The name sounded deliberately harmless. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. In reality, it was one of the most secretive special operations organizations of the Vietnam War. Its missions included reconnaissance, sabotage, psychological operations, prisoner capture, personnel recovery, and covert operations inside enemy-controlled territory. In 1965, one of its most important new missions received the code name Shining Brass. Its purpose was to send small reconnaissance teams across the border into Laos. They were to locate traffic and enemy installations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The missions were extraordinarily dangerous. A small team could find itself tens or even hundreds of kilometers from a secure base. If the enemy discovered the team, help might not arrive quickly. The teams had to move quietly, avoid contact, observe the enemy, report target locations by radio, and escape before enemy forces could surround them. Sometimes, the intelligence they provided was used to call American combat aircraft against targets. This type of warfare was almost perfectly suited to Lauri Thorne's previous experience. He had commanded small patrols in Finland. He had operated close to enemy forces. He understood the importance of terrain, surprise, and intelligence. And above all, he was willing to accept risk. Thorne was assigned to duties connected with MACV-SOG. He served within the 5th Special Forces Group environment and became involved in Shining Brass operations. By this point, his military career had already lasted more than a quarter of a century. The Winter War, the Continuation War, the final battles in Germany, the United States Army Special Forces, his first Vietnam tour, and now covert operations in Southeast Asia. Thorne was one of the relatively few American Special Forces officers with such extensive real combat experience, but his new assignment introduced an entirely different danger. Laos was officially a neutral country, secret American ground. Operations there were therefore politically extremely sensitive. The missions had to remain covert. Reconnaissance teams operated as small units. They included local soldiers as well as Americans. Helicopters transported the teams close to their target areas. The men then continued on foot. Every flight near the border was dangerous. Helicopters had to fly over mountainous terrain covered by jungle. Weather could change rapidly. Navigation was difficult, and enemy anti-aircraft weapons could be waiting below. Thorne understood these risks. Nevertheless, he personally participated in the operations. By the autumn of 1965, Shining Brass was only beginning. The first reconnaissance teams were being inserted into Laos to locate the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In October, one of these reconnaissance missions required an officer to monitor the operation from the air. Lauri Törni volunteered for the mission. On October 18, 1965, he boarded a South Vietnamese Air Force CH-34 helicopter. A Vietnamese crew was aboard with him. Below, a Shining Brass reconnaissance team was operating in the jungle. Thorne's task was to monitor the mission from the air and assist the team if necessary. The weather began to deteriorate. Clouds covered the mountains. Darkness approached. The helicopter continued flying, then radio contact was lost. Lauri Thorne's helicopter never returned to base. The Bay, man who had survived the Winter War, the Continuation War, the collapse of Germany, prisons, escapes, the mountains of Iran, and the jungles of Vietnam had disappeared. But no one yet knew what had happened to him. A search was about to begin, a search that would last for decades. On October 18, 1965, Captain Lauri Thorne prepared for another dangerous mission. He was 46 years old. Behind him were more than 25 years of military life. The Winter War, the Continuation War, the final weeks of the war in Germany, the United States Army Special Forces, the mountains of Iran, and 2 tours in Vietnam. But this day would be different. Thorne was now serving in operations connected with MACV-SOG's secret Shining Brass program. Its purpose was to send small reconnaissance teams into Laos to locate North Vietnamese forces, bases, and supply routes. The operations were secret. Laos was officially a neutral country. The United States did not want to publicly acknowledge sending soldiers on such missions into its territory. The reconnaissance teams were small. Their mission was not to seek a major battle. They were supposed to enter enemy territory, undetected, observe, gather intelligence, report what they discovered, and escape before the enemy became aware of their presence. During the operation on October 18th, one such team was to be inserted into an operational area near the Laotian border. Lauri Thorne participated in the airborne control of the operation. He boarded a South Vietnamese Air Force CH-34 helicopter. The helicopter had a South Vietnamese crew. Thorne was the American aboard and the Special Forces officer participating in the control of the mission. The CH-34 was a large, piston-powered transport helicopter. In Vietnam, it was used to transport troops and supplies and for many specialized missions. But flying in the mountainous border region between Vietnam and Laos was dangerous, jungle-covered. Mountains rose steeply from the terrain, clouds could hide the peaks, weather conditions could change rapidly, and flying in darkness made navigation even more difficult. During the operation, conditions deteriorated. Evening approached. Clouds and mountainous terrain made flying increasingly difficult. The helicopter was operating in an area with few safe places to land. Thorne continued the mission. Below him, a reconnaissance team was operating on the ground. Its success depended partly on the helicopters above. They were the connection between the men in the jungle and their bases. As the operation continued, Thorne's CH-34 disappeared. Radio contact with the aircraft was lost. The helicopter did not return. At first, no one knew for certain what had happened. Had the aircraft been shot down? Had its engine failed? Had the helicopter struck a mountain? Had anyone aboard survived? There were no answers. Only one fact was certain: Lauri Thorne was missing. A search began, but the area was enormous. The mountains were covered in jungle. From the air, the wreckage of a helicopter could disappear, almost completely beneath the vegetation. Weather complicated the search. Enemy activity also restricted. Where American and South Vietnamese personnel could operate, Thorne and the helicopter crew were not found. A man who had survived countless dangerous situations had simply disappeared into the mountains of Southeast Asia. The United States Army listed him as missing in action, but there was no certainty about his fate as the years passed. The war in Vietnam grew into an enormous conflict. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers served there. Thousands were killed, and some remained missing. Lauri Thorne was one of them. His military career, however, did not officially end with the rank of captain. He was posthumously promoted to major. He also received additional American military decorations. But for his family, friends, and former comrades, one important question remained. Where was Lauri Thorne? Years became decades. The Vietnam War ended. American forces left Southeast Asia. The Cold War continued. Eventually, even the Soviet Union collapsed. But Törni's disappearance remained unresolved. Then, nearly 30 years after his final flight, search teams returned to the region. Helicopter wreckage was discovered in the mountains, and gradually, investigators began to uncover what had happened to Lauri Thorne on October 18, 1965. Lauri Törni's journey had ended on a jungle-covered mountain, but his final journey home was only beginning. On October 18, 1965, Lauri Thorne's helicopter disappeared in the mountainous region near the Vietnam-Laos border. Along with Thorne, the aircraft carried its South Vietnamese crew. Despite search efforts, the helicopter was not found. Lauri Thorne remained missing. The years passed. The Vietnam War continued for almost another decade. The United States withdrew from the conflict. Saigon fell in 1975. Vietnam was unified under communist rule, but Lauri Thorne's name remained on the list of missing American servicemen. His former comrades did not forget him, nor did the United States abandon its efforts to account for servicemen missing in Southeast Asia. The task was enormous. The Vietnam War had left thousands of cases in which the fate of American personnel had not been conclusively determined. In Thorne's case, the general area of his final flight was known, but that was not enough. The mountains were steep. The vegetation was dense. Jungle could almost completely conceal the wreckage of an aircraft or helicopter within only a few years. The region also remained difficult to access for political and military reasons. Decades passed. Had Lauri Thorne survived, he would have grown old alongside the men with whom he had served in Finland and the United States. But for Thorne, time had stopped in October 1965. Then came a breakthrough. During the 1990s, American investigators were increasingly able to cooperate with countries in the region and investigate old lost sites. Information concerning Thorne's final flight was examined again. Witness information was studied. Possible crash areas were searched. In 1999, a search team climbed a difficult mountain near the Vietnam-Laos border. The terrain was exactly the kind that had made the original search nearly impossible. Steep, covered in jungle, extremely difficult to reach. Then pieces of metal began appearing on the mountain, aircraft components, equipment, and objects indicating the presence of the missing helicopter. The searchers had found the crash site. The helicopter that had disappeared more than 3 decades earlier had finally been located. The site was systematically investigated. This was not an ordinary archaeological excavation. Every object could help identify the missing men. Soil was carefully screened. Helicopter components were documented. Personal effects were recovered, and eventually, human remains were also discovered. But finding remains alone did not immediately solve everything. Several men had been aboard the helicopter. Decades in a tropical environment had made identification difficult. Investigators had to combine physical remains, dental records, personal effects, and other evidence. Gradually, the picture became clear. The evidence established that the site was the wreckage from Lauri Thorne's final flight. The fate of the crew could finally be resolved. Lauri Thorne had been found. Almost 34 years after his disappearance, one of the United States Army's long-standing MIA cases had an answer. The helicopter had crashed into the mountain. Everyone aboard had died. Törni's life had therefore ended on October 18, 1965, not as an enemy prisoner, not years later living under a secret identity, but in a helicopter crash in the mountains. One final task remained. Lauri Thorne had to be brought home. The identified remains were returned to the United States, and on June 26, 2003, a military funeral ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington is one of the most famous military cemeteries in the United States. Servicemen from different wars throughout American history rest there. Now they were joined by a man whose military career had begun thousands of kilometers away in Finland. Lauri Thorne and the South Vietnamese crewmen from his final flight were buried together. Törni's life had followed an extraordinary path, from Viipuri into the Finnish army, from the Winter War to the Continuation War, from Germany to prison, from Finland to Sweden, from Sweden to Venezuela, from Venezuela to the United States, from the U.S. Army to Special Forces, from the mountains of Iran to the jungles of Vietnam, and finally back to the United States. Lauri Törni had been born in Finland in 1919. Lauri Thorne disappeared in Vietnam in 1965. Only in 2003 did his final journey end at Arlington. But Törni's story did not end with his funeral. Over the decades, a legend had developed around him. In Finland, he was remembered as a knight of the Mannerheim Cross. In the United States, he was remembered as a Green Beret officer. Buildings and memorials were named in his honor. Books were written about his life. His military career inspired admiration, but it also generated controversy, because there were chapters in Lauri Törni's life that cannot be understood simply as a heroic story. He served in the armed forces of 3 different countries. He fought in several wars. He served twice in Germany. He was convicted of treason in Finland, and he later became one of the best-known Finnish-born soldiers in the history of the United States Army Special Forces. That makes his life both extraordinary and controversial. So the next question is, what in Lauri Törni's story is documented history, and what became legend over the decades? After Lauri Törni's death, a legend gradually began to form around him. It was easy to understand why. His documented biography alone sounds almost like the script of a film. He was born in Viipuri in 1919. He fought in the Winter War. He became an officer. He fought in the Continuation War. He commanded his own Jaeger company. He received the Mannerheim Cross. He served in Germany. He was convicted of treason in Finland. He escaped from prison. He left Finland. He reached the United States. He began his military career again as an ordinary private. He became a Green Beret. He served in Vietnam. And finally, he disappeared during a secret operation in 1965. With a life story like this, it is easy for documented events and later legend to become mixed together. That is why 3 things should be distinguished when discussing Törni's life: what historical documents establish, what his fellow soldiers later remembered, and what was added to the story over the following decades. One thing, however, is beyond dispute. Lauri Törni was an extraordinarily experienced soldier. His military career began in 1938. When the Winter War began, he was already serving in the Finnish army. During the war, He demonstrated his abilities in patrol operations and small unit leadership. During the continuation war, his reputation grew. Detachment Törni was formed around him. Among the soldiers who served in the unit was the future president of Finland, Mauno Koivisto. In the summer of 1944, Törni received one of Finland's highest military honors. He became Knight of the Mannerheim Cross number 144. This part of Törni's reputation is firmly based on documented military history, but his life also contained a considerably more difficult chapter. Germany. Törni first traveled to Germany in 1941. He served briefly within the Waffen-SS organization and received the rank of SS Untersturmführer. During this first period, however, he did not reach the front and returned to Finland. This was not his only period of German service. After Finland concluded an armistice with the Soviet Union in 1944, the situation changed fundamentally. Finland was required to remove German forces from its territory. Former brothers in arms became enemies. Despite this, Törni returned to Germany in January 1945. He received training there and again entered German military service. During the final weeks of the war, he served in German uniform. This occurred when Nazi Germany's defeat was already effectively inevitable. Törni's motives have been debated extensively. One central explanation has been his intense opposition to the Soviet Union. Törni had spent years fighting the Red Army. He also feared a possible Soviet occupation of Finland, but motivation and legal responsibility are two different things. In 1945, Finland and Germany were enemies. By entering German military service, Törni served a state with which Finland was at war. The Finnish justice system dealt with the case on that basis. In 1947, Törni was sentenced to 6 years in prison for treason. President J.K. Paasikivi pardoned him the following year. Later, Törni's life took another almost unbelievable turn. He reached the United States. In 1954, he joined the United States Army under the name Lauri Thorne. He had to begin again as a private, but his previous experience had not disappeared. Törni advanced rapidly. He entered Special Forces. He became an officer, again, and his expertise was used in areas including winter warfare, skiing, mountain operations, and small unit tactics. In Iran's Zagros Mountains, that experience was tested under real conditions. In Vietnam, he entered a real war once again. There, another part of the Törni legend began to develop. Author Robin Moore used Green Beret soldiers like Thorne as material for his famous work, The Green Berets. Real events were transformed into literature. Characters were combined. Battles were dramatized. And gradually, the real Lauri Thorne became difficult to separate from the Green Beret legend of popular culture. For this reason, not every dramatic story told about Törni is equally well documented, but his achievements do not require exaggeration. The documented history is already extraordinary. Törni served in the Finnish army. He served twice in German military organizations. And eventually, he served in the United States Army. He fought against the Soviet Union in Europe. Years later, he served in American Cold War Special Forces. And in Vietnam, he participated in secret reconnaissance operations against communist forces. But it is important to avoid an overly simple picture. Lauri Törni was not merely a hero, nor can his life be reduced solely to his service in Germany. He was a historical figure whose decisions were made amid war, politics, ideology, and personal choice. Some of those decisions brought him high military decorations. Others brought him imprisonment. And it is precisely this contradiction that makes his life so fascinating. Törni also appears to have been one of those people for whom military life was more than simply a profession. It became the central structure of his life. When one army closed its doors to him, he searched for another. When one war ended, years later he found himself in another, from Finland to Germany, from Germany to the United States, from Europe to Vietnam. When Lauri Thorne disappeared in 1965, His military career had occupied almost his entire adult life. After his death, two countries came to remember him in somewhat different ways. In Finland, he is primarily Lauri Törni, Knight of the Mannerheim Cross, commander of Detachment Törni. In the United States, he is Larry Thorne, Green Beret. Special Forces Officer, a soldier missing in Vietnam. But both names belong to the same man, a man whose real life was so extraordinary that no legend needs to be added to it. In the next and final part, we will return once more to where the journey began, Viipuri, and for the last time, we will follow the road that carried a Finnish young man into 3 different armies, several wars, and ultimately to Arlington National Cemetery. The story of Lauri Törni is approaching its end. On May 28, 1919, a boy named Lauri Törni was born in Viipuri, Finland. No one could have known where his extraordinary life would eventually take him. Less than 20 years later, Europe was moving toward another great war. In September 1938, Törni began his military service in the Finnish Army. It marked the beginning of a military career that, in one form or another, would continue for almost the rest of his life. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939, Törni went to war. The Winter War became his first real experience of combat. It would not be his last. When the Continuation War began in 1941, Törni returned to the front. He developed into a skilled leader of small units, patrolling, reconnaissance, ambushes, rapid attacks operating in difficult terrain. These became defining characteristics of his military career. Eventually, a unit was formed around him that became known by his own name, Detachment Törni. Among the soldiers who served in its ranks was a young man named Mauno Koivisto. Decades later, Koivisto would become president of Finland. In the summer of 1944, Törni's achievements were recognized with one of Finland's highest military honors. He became Knight of the Mannerheim Cross number 144. But Finland's war against the Soviet Union ended. Törni's war did not. In 1945, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his life. He went to Germany. Törni had already received military training in Germany in 1941, but now the situation was completely different. Finland and Germany were enemies. Despite this, Törni again entered German military service and served in German uniform during the final months of the war. After Germany's defeat, he became an Allied prisoner. He escaped, returned to Finland, was arrested by the Finnish authorities, and in 1947, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for treason. Knight of the Mannerheim Cross was now a prisoner in his own country, but even that did not become the end of Törni's story. President J.K. Paasikivi pardoned him in 1948. The following year, Törni left Finland, Sweden, Venezuela, and eventually the United States, a new country, a new language, a new name. Larry Thorne. In January 1954, he began again from the very bottom. A veteran who had served as a captain in Finland and received the Mannerheim Cross entered the United States Army as an ordinary private. But his experience was noticed. Thorne advanced. He became airborne qualified, trained in mountain warfare. He entered the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets, and eventually he became an officer again. A man who had learned to fight in the forests of Finland was now training American soldiers in Cold War Europe. In 1962, his skills were needed in Iran's Zagros Mountains, and American military aircraft had crashed in extremely difficult mountain terrain. Thorne participated in a Special Forces operation that reached the wreckage and recovered important material and the remains of those who had died. But one more war was waiting. Vietnam. Thorne served his first tour in Vietnam in 1963 and 1964. He operated as an American Special Forces officer in an environment completely different from the forests of Finland or the mountains of Europe. He returned to Vietnam again in 1965. This time, he became involved in secret special operations, MACV-SOG, Shining Brass. Reconnaissance teams were sent into dangerous areas to locate North Vietnamese forces and activity along the Ho Chi Minh Trail on October 18, 1965. Lauri Thorne boarded a helicopter. He was 46 years old. He had been a soldier for almost his entire adult life. The helicopter flew toward the mountainous border region. The weather deteriorated. Clouds covered the mountains. Then contact with the aircraft was lost. The helicopter never returned. Lauri Thorne was missing. For decades, no one could say with certainty where his final resting place was located. Then searchers discovered the remains of the helicopter. In 2003, the long journey finally ended at Arlington National Cemetery. Lauri Törni's life had carried him from Viipuri to Arlington, from service under the Finnish flag to the German armed forces, and from there to service under the flag of the United States. It is easy to romanticize his story, but the real history is more complicated. Törni was unquestionably a skilled and courageous soldier. He led men in combat. He was awarded the Mannerheim Cross in Finland. In the United States, he built an entirely new military career and entered special forces. But his life also included decisions that continue to raise difficult questions. He served in military organizations of Nazi Germany. He returned to German service even when Finland and Germany were at war, and for this, he was convicted of treason in Finland. History does not need to be altered to make Törni's life more interesting. Quite the opposite. It is precisely the contradictions that make his story extraordinary. The same man could at one point be a decorated Finnish war hero, at another, a prisoner in a Finnish prison, and later, an officer in the United States Army Special Forces. 3 armies, several wars, 2 names, 1 life. Lauri Törni, Lauri Thorne. People can reach very different conclusions about him, but few Finnish soldiers lived a life that followed such an improbable path. The boy born in Viipuri in 1919 eventually came to rest thousands of kilometers away among the white headstones of Arlington. There, his journey finally ended, but his story continues, not simply as a legend, but as part of the history of Finland, the Second World War, the Cold War, and the United States Army Special Forces. And perhaps that is why the life of Lauri Törni continues to fascinate people more than 60 years after his disappearance. What do you think about Lauri Törni? Was he above all an extraordinary Finnish soldier? Or do his choices during his years in German service make his legacy far more complicated? Share your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more carefully researched stories from military history, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Thank you for watching. This was the story of Lauri Törni.